We are ready.
We can start now. We are live on Facebook.
Okay, Nikhil, shall we start now or still? Nikhil, we start now or should we wait?
Yeah, Isaac has come.
Yeah, he has come. Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Joe, you last.
Nikhil, we couldn't hear, sorry. Nikhil? Nikhil, we couldn't hear you.
Let's go from there. I'll phone you. Hello, Dr. Isaac.
Yes.
Very good to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's really important for us that you come, and it's a great way for us to be able to start this, because actually Kerala has been such a counterpoint in the whole country, and your public discourses have been such a counterpoint not only for us in the country but across the world. So I think about the Janta Parliament you are aware, so I won't go into it. I'll just immediately hand over to Joe, who's going to coordinate the session. But just from all our side, very great thank you, and we hope to be able to carry these important voices and issues of center-state relations, of finances, of all the things that you deal with, and hope that we can also, like Kerala has involved its people, we can get involved in the whole country through the examples you give. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Joe, please
Sure.
do
Thank
carry
you.
on.
Thank you. I'm pleased to declare that the House is now in session.
Joe, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Sure. I'm pleased to declare that the House is now in session. Good afternoon and welcome to you all. This Janta Parliament was started on May 16th. The budget session of Parliament was curtailed due to COVID-19 and the sudden imposition of lockdown. And since then, Parliament has not been in session. The pandemic and the lockdown have fundamentally altered people's lives, and almost no sector or section of society has been left unaffected. Several far-reaching and even controversial policy decisions taken by the government have escaped any kind of legislative scrutiny or representative accountability. Therefore, concerned citizens have decided to get together and convene a Janta Parliament to discuss urgent COVID-related policy measures. This session is on economy. The economy was on a fast slide before the pandemic hit us. Job loss was at its highest in 46 years. Industrial output was low. Many economists said we are in the middle of a crisis and won't be long before we call it a recession. The slowdown affected demand, employment, living standards, and it was punishing for the informal sector, which broke its back since the time of demonetization. What started as a major jolt for informal sector has now come to affect the formal sector as well, with yesterday's Economic Times putting the figure of job loss in formal sector at 18 million since March. Incomes were drastically affected. Whatever done by the government was not addressing the basic income generation and employment, but was taking steps which was good for advertisements and less for real economy, like improving its ease of doing business ranking or opening up different sectors for FDI instead of investing more on rural employment or increasing public spending in health, education, and such key and employment generation sectors. All those fault lines in economy which we were facing have been laid bare by COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic, in fact, was used by the government to government as an excuse to cover up past failures as well as its continued apathy towards taking genuine measures to revive the economy. The 20 lakh crore economic stimulus package announced by the Prime Minister was a farce that propagated the policies which had in the first place led to an economic crisis even before the onset of the COVID pandemic. It was a repackaging of existing allocations, policies, and programs to look like a stimulus package. There are a number of issues in the larger realm of economy which deserves our urgent attention. At a time when the fiscal federalism should have strengthened, the arbitrary decisions of the central government has led to a situation, as Thomas Isaacson says, a collapse of fiscal federalism. The states which were left to face the brunt of situation were denied of its rightful share of even GST collections, let alone any new package, nor were allowed to borrow from RBI directly, forcing them to go to the markets to raise revenues, raising fears that nearly all states would be staring at huge debts by end of the pandemic. Financial irregularities and scams are not investigated. Weakening of public and regulatory institutions have made them play a subjugated role under the present regime. As we have read in the newspapers today, even the funds collected under PM CARES is not allowed to be audited by CAG. Non-performing assets with which our banks have been burdened with will see new heights with this pandemic. However irrational it may sound and damaging it will be, higher NPAs will be another excuse for this government to push for privatization of public sector banks as well as for more mergers. Despite the biggest banker of the country saying that we have money to lend but not takers, the MSME sector is reeling under distress, with the sector not given adequate loans, leading to nearly 3 crore job losses in the sector. What a decentralized governance structure can do in times of crisis was seen from Kerala experience. What higher allocations in health and education can result into was also learned from Kerala. However, India's public expenditure on health as a percentage of GDP is a little over 1% of one of the world's lowest. And on education, India spends 4.6% of the total GDP, ranking 62nd in total public expenditure on education per student. The pandemic seemed to have come as a blessing in disguise for a government which gives little to public debates and decision making. The number of ordinances and amendments made or under consideration on environment, labor laws, electricity act, etc. stand witness to that. There are rating agencies which estimates India's GDP growth to hit a zero this fiscal year. With a handful of corporate lenders amassing wealth even during the pandemic may widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, causing inequality to further rise. It is under this context that we believe that there is an urgent need for people's representatives to discuss the state of economy, make the decision-making transparent, and hold the government accountable for its failures. Since that's not happening, the Janta Parliament is discussing these issues. We will start the proceedings now. Each speaker will have 15 minutes each. I now invite Dr. Thomas Isaac to speak. Thomas Isaac, as you know, is the Minister for Finance from Kerala. He has been with the Center for Development Studies earlier. Welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Joe, if I could just make an announcement before that. This is just for interpretation. The proceedings are all being translated into English as well as Hindi based on the language the speaker speaks. See an interpretation.
Nachiket, you are not clear. Can you come again on the interpretation?
My speech will be translated to Hindi simultaneously.
Yes, I think there are. Yeah, I think Japanese needs to be selected for Hindi translation. Am I right, Nachiket?
That is right. For Hindi translations, please select Japanese on the little globe icon at the bottom of the screen.
Thank you, Asma.
This is from Hindi to English. I mean, from English to Hindi. I'm so sorry.
Over to you, sir.
Yes, esteemed friends, under the cover of pandemic, we are witnessing a major assault on on federal structure of our nation. If you examine, say, the laws that have already been passed or considered in the parliament, or the ones that are being now drawn up, they include a whole variety of them: labor code, education policy, uh, NIA amendment, and so on. So many of them. The common denominator is undermining your state rights. Of all these legislation that are being already adopted or contemplated. So this is a very, very major issue. I shall focus on fiscal federalism. Now, I know, as all of us know, there is a fundamental imbalance in the federal financial structure of India, as in all federations. The states contribute to around 60% of the intergovernmental expenditure, total expenditure, while the revenues are only 40% of the overall revenue. So there is a constitutional mechanism of finance commission, which are appointed every 5 years to look into the situation and give the award, how much must be devoted. Now, if you take the trend in India since independence, this vertical imbalance has tended to increase over time. Say in 1950-51, the pre-devolution gap was only 2.41 and steadily increased and reached, by the time this present government came, 7.71%. And now, say before the pandemic, it had closed 10%. Now, post-devolution gap, 50-51, 1.95%, it increased over time to 4.87 in 2013-14. And then the pre-pandemic period reached 6.16. Now, is my contention, if you look at the vertical imbalance today during the pandemic, it would have gone berserk. The pre-devolution gap, post-devolution gap, in fact, all the states are forced to cut expenditure because there is them. Now, this is a serious issue because it has implications how the nation is going to face this pandemic challenge. It has very serious implications for the welfare of people during these trying times. Now, Finance Minister of Kerala, come to this parliament because there is no way we can air these issues which infringe upon not only the spirit of our constitution, but also letter of the law passed by the parliament. And I want to flag 5 of them, and that's what I shall do in my brief time. The first, the parliament passed a GST law which guaranteed the states, after long discussions in the parliament and outside, a 14% growth in the GST revenue and guaranteed the shortfall would be compensated through a compensation cess administered by the council. Now, GST revenue is sharply fallen and the gap to be filled, compensation paid has increased. The minister, finance minister, makes a statement in the assembly that compensation will be paid if there is fund in the compensation cess fund, and that is not something but the law says. Now, then it was promised. But this issue had been discussed a number of times while the law was framed in the GST Council, where we were assured that suppose in such a case, the case of lack of funds in the fund arises to pay the compensation, the then finance minister assured, and it's on the record, that we will empower the GST Council to borrow, and you can borrow and pay the money back by extending the cess for another year or two. That's it. So simple a thing. But today, for example, the states of India, the center owes something like 1 lakh crores minimum. That's a huge amount of money. Twice before when the parliament was meeting, the GST Council convened, and it was said, okay, immediately after the parliament session is over, special council of the GST Council meeting or GST Council will be called and will take a decision on it. So far, the GST Council has not met. Instead, you have a situation where states are being pressurized. Now, these times have changed. You can't ask for 14% buoyancy. Can you think of revising? And none other than the chairman of the 16th Finance Commission himself comes to the GST Council, that is before the Parliament session, saying that the states have to revisit this. Now, that is a very surprising statement to come. Finance Commission is not an advocate for the center. It's going to be arbiter of the interest between the states and center. So this is my first complaint of Parliament, that the whole stance today adopted by the central government is not only against spirit, but the letter of the law that has been passed. Second, there has been a sharp decline in the central transfers to states because the divisible pool has shrunk because the revenues have gone down. So states have been saying, increase our borrowing limit. Okay. Now borrowing limit has been raised by 2%. But for the first time in the history of India, conditions have been imposed on loans. Never before has any loans given to states have been unconditional, except for the interest rates and so on. But for the first time, conditions such as there are about 4 major conditions which are again divided into subsets. Therefore, total around 10 of them. Each of them, you do this, you get 0.25, you do this, 0.15. Can you imagine such disgraceful micromanagement of states? How they should tax the property, whether they have to have DBT in the agriculture. Like that it goes on. See, now the central government stance is, very well, these are not very difficult. If there's a will, you can do it. States are on record. In the last GST Council, where even ruling party led states, they came forward saying, increase at least the unconditional portion of the loan to 1%. First, you put condition, because many of us are going to be able to meet that condition. So this is a major issue in fiscal federalism. Central government has started putting conditions on loans, and then tomorrow they can put conditions on the loans, the normal loans also. They have opened the gates for that. 3. Now, one of the reasons why the divisible pool has shrunk so much is that central government, against the spirit of the constitution, is increasing indirect taxes through levying special additional excise, say, special cesses or customs duty, rather than indirect taxes which have to be shared with the states. Now, with the lockdown was the announcement, came an announcement of steep increase in the excise duty on petrol, diesel, and crude oil. Right? Now, not excise, duty on that. But it was not the normal excise duty or a customs duty, and no, normal excise duty which was shareable with, but it was a special excise duty, road cess fund, or customs duty which doesn't have to be shared with the state. So the biggest revenue source for the center was operated in such a manner it wouldn't have to be shared with the states. That's the three one. And fourth one has already been uttered by Ajay. That's PM cares. Okay, there has been sufficient debate on PM care. I don't want to elaborate on it. But my complaint is, well, PM cares CSR funds can be transferred, but not to state CMDRF. Earlier, Indian companies could donate to the CMDRF, the Chief Minister's Digital Release. That right has been taken away and has been given to the PM cares, which are non-transparent. They have already replied, we cannot reveal any information on that because it puts disproportionate time, effort on the part of the institution. And now the Supreme Court has ordered that it needed also be audited. So that's my fourth complaint. Now, fifth one is the centrally sponsored schemes. At least in this pandemic times, when you're giving NHM, give it on a grant from the center. See, such is the challenge of the health care in the states. What is the additional fund that is being given? There's some 15,000 crores to be spent on 3 years. What about your wellness centers in the Ayushman Bharat? What about the district COVID hospitals that were promised? So they have been so stingy on the public health. This is scandal. And all this combined together, and I shall conclude now, has made state finances untenable. I tell you the case of Kerala. Okay, from our normal borrowing, half were permitted. We have been permitted to be borrowed. The borrowing up to the first 3 quarters, December has been allowed. Let me tell you, we have exhausted that borrowing. There are 6 more months to go. 5 more months to go. And because we believe that this pandemic time, people has to be supported, helped. Kerala, we are providing food kit every month to every family in Kerala. We are providing industry loans and support MSME and people, consumption loans also to people at concessional loans. Because of the pandemic situation, we are front-loading all the entitlements of the people like welfare pensions, scholarships, and so on, paying them advance so that money reaches the people. Because of hard budget constraint, this is the only way that we can spend. That we front-load our borrowing, and we have done it. And now, suppose this additional 0.5% is not permitted, say next month and so on, we are in serious trouble. What will be Kerala forced to do? Cut the expenditure. That's happening all over India. All over India. It's such a disgrace what is being done for the poor of India. I wouldn't blame the states, any state government, only they don't have the resources. And the state governments cutting the expenditure in times of a pandemic recession is crazy to say. And everybody, all economics teaches you that when you have recession, you try to boost the aggregate demand by governments increasing the government spending. And we have the state of India, where 60% of the intergovernmental expenditure is uh, made by the state government. Central government make some gesture in increasing the spending, but it is more than neutralized by the cut in the expenditure of the state governments. This is the simplest way to aggravate the recession and ensure that we are going to have a long, flat curve. So it's a very serious matter, not just a fiscal federalism, states' rights, but this infringement of state rights is also affecting the welfare and the prospects of our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I mean, it was really a scary picture of where things stands now. It was an insider view about how bad the fiscal federalism now is, and also explained to us that fundamentally how the structure is wrong currently. That it doesn't empowers the state, but only kind of weakens it. That's very concerning. I now move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Prabhat Patnaik. He's highly respected political economist, commentator, and a staunch critic of the neoliberal economic policies. He was also the chairman of Kerala State Planning Board earlier. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to the Janta Parliament, because everybody at the moment is preoccupied with the pandemic, and the pandemic clearly is having a very serious adverse repercussion on the economy. We tend to associate the economic crisis exclusively with the pandemic. As a matter of fact, however, even before the pandemic, the Indian economy was sinking into a very serious economic crisis. You yourself mentioned the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate that prevailed prior to the pandemic was higher than at any time over the previous 4.5 decades. There is another bit of information which is of great significance, namely that when you have the National Sample Survey consumption expenditure data, you find that between 2011-12 and 2017-18, as you know, the NSS has quinquennial large sample surveys of consumer expenditure. Between these two dates, the per capita real consumption expenditure in rural India actually declined by 9%. Now, this is quite unprecedented. In fact, since independence, I'm not aware of any period in which across a quinquennium, the per capita real income in rural India had declined at all, let alone declined by 9%. Now, this is a very serious affair. It is not even as if in 2011-12, the people of the country were so well fed that they could afford to take a cut in their consumption. As a matter of fact, when you look at the data on calorie intake, on the basis of which we define poverty in India, per capita calorie intake per day, which is supposed to be 2,200 calories. Below that, we say the people are poor. Above that, we say they are not. So that's the benchmark for defining poverty. You find that less than 2,200 calories per person per day. In 1993-4, which was this more or less the start of the period of neoliberal economic policies, is the first quinquennial NSS survey after the beginning of neoliberal economic policies. The proportion of rural population that fell below 2,200 calories was 58%. By 2011-12, it had gone up to 68%. Therefore, you find that over this period, hunger, malnutrition, nutritional deprivation, and poverty has actually increased. On top of that, when we find a decline in per capita real expenditure in rural India, then we are obviously in the midst of an extremely serious situation, on top of which the pandemic is going to have an effect. In other words, all this I'm talking about is prior to the pandemic itself. And the pandemic, as you know, everybody is talking about the contraction in GDP that would occur. The pandemic certainly is going to make it the worst year since independence. But I'm saying that the crisis, even before, was serious enough. Recovery from this is going to be an extremely difficult situation, therefore, for two reasons. One reason is that there's already a crisis, and therefore it's not just enough to wait for the pandemic to be over and then to imagine that things would be back to normal. As a matter of fact, pre-pandemic itself is a very serious crisis. Secondly, when you get a shock like the pandemic, then you find that even if consumption recovers, investment does not recover immediately, doesn't recover easily, doesn't recover over even a reasonable period of time. This is what had happened in the advanced countries in the 1930s when the Great Depression happened. By the late 1930s, consumption had recovered more or less to the levels, or the consumption goods sector capacity utilization had been more or less what it had been before the Depression. But in the capital goods sector, there was very little, very low capacity utilization, just about 10% capacity utilization in the United States. So investment takes a very long time, if at all, to recover, even if there is a recovery from the pandemic. So, firstly, the normal course of things, the recovery is going to be difficult and prolonged. And secondly, since we already have a crisis predating the pandemic, therefore, recovery is going to be even more tricky, even more difficult. Now, I said that 4.5 decades ago, unemployment levels might have been high, but 4.5 decades ago, naturally, the question arises, what had happened 4.5 decades ago? 4.5 decades ago is a period when we had the first oil shock. When we had the first oil shock, we actually had a 30% inflation in the country, because of which there was a cutback in government expenditure, austerity measures were introduced by the government, so that unemployment increased. But that was a crisis very different from the crisis that we are witnessing today. That was a very clear, palpable external shock that actually OPEC countries decided to raise their prices, and not just raise their prices, to treble their prices. But that had an enormous impact on the world economy, including the Indian economy. But this is a very, very different situation. Even before the pandemic, you find that obviously unemployment is very high. Obviously, as I said, there is an increase in poverty, there's an increase in deprivation, nutritional deprivation, and so on, which arises not because of any palpable external shock, but because of the functioning of the system itself. Now, why, in fact, do we have this crisis? It's important to see that, firstly, of course, there is a crisis all over the world. And the crisis all over the world is because of the fact that world income inequalities have increased enormously. Or what you like, if you'd like to put it that way, the share of economic surplus in the world's output, that means output minus the incomes of the working people, I call that the economic surplus, that share has increased enormously, which basically amounts to saying that there is a shift of income distribution from the working people to the property owners all over the world. Now, of course, it is the case that when there is such a shift, then at the margin, out of a rupee shifted like that, the property owners don't necessarily consume all of the rupee, while the working people do. As a result, every such shift implies a reduction in demand for consumption. And of course, with a reduction in demand for consumption, then investment too tends to get cut. And therefore, this tends to generate overproduction. This is what is happening all over the world. There's a reason for the world economy slowing down. That has its impact on the Indian economy because obviously our exports then also suffer. But additionally, a very similar process has been happening in the Indian economy itself. Namely, the share of surplus in total output has increased enormously. It is also visible in terms of personal income distribution. Piketty and Chanchal, two French economists, made this calculation based on income tax data. Income tax, you remember, was introduced in India in 1922. And they found for the latest year that they had got this estimate done, which was 2013-14 and 2014-15. They found that the proportion of the total national income going to the top 1% of the population was higher during these years than it had been at any time since 1922. And let's not forget that those days we had Maharajas and so on, a lot of income inequality. But even compared to that, we actually found that they actually found that the percentage of the top 1% was higher in 2014-15 and 13-14 compared to any date in between. Now, this clearly, therefore, has its impact on the pattern of demand, on the level of demand, and therefore there's an inadequacy of demand. This inadequacy of demand is also obvious in another way. You know, prior to the pandemic, just on the eve of the pandemic, there was 77 million tons of food grains lying around with the Food Corporation of India. Now, I have just been giving you figures about people's food consumption, food intake going down. How come that despite food intake going down, there were huge amounts of food grain stocks which were lying around with the FCI? Essentially because people simply did not have adequate purchasing power to purchase the food grains, which of course they would normally have done because they have been getting increasingly malnourished. Now, in this context, therefore, the whole government policy should be to inject purchasing power in the hands of the people, to put purchasing power in the hands of the people. What our Modi government is doing is exactly the opposite. You look at every one of those measures they have taken. Firstly, against the trade unions. Secondly, enlarging the number of hours of work of the workers, in other words, generally against the working class and against the trade union movement. Thirdly, you have these ordinances for the peasantry. Then you have the environmental clearance becomes now much easier. Hardly any questions are going to be raised. Huge amounts of fiscal transfers to the pockets of the capitalists. Now, all these are ways in which income distribution is being tilted in favor of the capitalist class on the assumption that if you did so, then of course they're going to make investments and therefore the economy would recover. As a matter of fact, capitalists don't invest unless demand is growing. And therefore, demand has to be generated first before you can expect the capitalist to make an investment. And every such adverse income distribution is one which actually reduces the level of demand because of the fact that it transfers income from the poor to the rich, from the working people to the capitalists, and of course the former have a higher propensity to consume at the margin compared to the latter. And therefore every such transfer has a further effect of dampening demand. As a result, everything that the government has been doing by way of overcoming the crisis is in fact something which is going to aggravate the crisis. What is necessary now is for the government to spend more, not just the central government, but also the state governments, and center therefore should make resources available to the state. And what is more, this can be easily financed through a combination of wealth and inheritance taxation. In India, we have no wealth taxation worth the name. And we know that actually wealth concentration has been increasing even more rapidly than income concentration. We made a calculation that if you put a 2% wealth tax on the top 1% of wealth holders, And of course, mind you, the moment you put a wealth tax, they are going to parcel their wealth among their children and progeny, and therefore it has to be backed with an inheritance tax. So we calculated that if you put a 2% wealth tax on only the top 1% of the population, and you also put a 1/3 inheritance tax. That means if I pass 100 rupees to my child, then 33 rupees out of it would be taken by the government. These two alone would generate enough resources to finance 5 fundamental economic rights, which would be universal and justiciable: the right to food, the right to employment, the right to free healthcare on the pattern of the NHS in Britain or in Scandinavian countries, the right to free quality publicly funded education, at least up to the secondary level, and the right to old age pension and disability benefits, the old age pension being 3,000 rupees per month compared to the current measly sums. So it is very possible, very easy to transform India into a welfare state by taxing property, by taxing wealth combined with an inheritance tax. But what is required is really to put enough to mobilize opinion in favor of this. And that is what I would like this Janata Parliament to really be doing. Thank you very much.
Professor Patnaik, thank you so. Thank you very much. Recovery is long, and a crisis predatory to pandemic will take it longer. Is a warning which we hope the central government also will take it seriously. And thank you so much for showing us also a way out to how to deal with it. Not that all is bad. Not that nothing can be kind of done about it. If there is a political will, there is a way out. And thank you so much for telling us about it. I'll call the next speaker now, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar. Professor Chandrasekhar was a professor at Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has been one of the key voices from the academia against the neoliberal policies over the past few decades. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to this parliament. And I just wanted to bring to the attention in the few minutes that I would be speaking of this parliament, continuing on what the previous two speakers have said, is that we must distinguish between, one, the fact that over a long period of time, because of the inability of the Indian state to undertake the necessary institutional change, and therefore the inequalities in assets and incomes which got intensified, and because of the inability of the state to be able to mobilize resources to undertake the expenditures necessary to expand the domestic market, and on that basis generate a process of a wage and self-employment earnings-led growth. We knew that all of this combined with the fact that over a period of time, because the peasantry were not obtaining the remunerative prices they needed to make crop production viable, the economy was in a deep crisis in any case. But the main point today is that what we are observing, not just because of the kind of response which the government has to the pandemic, but even prior to that response, the NDA government has in part engineered an intensification of this crisis. And I think that is what we need to place on the table and try to understand, because that is what we need to oppose immediately, while proceeding with the larger task of seeking to obtain a more egalitarian pattern of growth, which would of course be not merely better in terms of its welfare benefits, but also better in terms of the outcomes it would generate in terms of growth. Now, in what sense has the state engineered an intensification of this crisis? And principally, I think it comes from using a neoliberal facade to actually undertake a set of policies which clearly benefit the top, I wouldn't even say 1%, but less than 1% of the population, particularly a small set of crony capitalists who in some sense have been who've cultivated this government and who've been built by this government. Now, the fact that there is this kind of a tendency to engineer an intensification of the crisis came through last September, when it was becoming clear that not only was there a significant deceleration of the rate of growth of the Indian economy, but a deceleration of growth which was essentially because of a loss of demand buoyancy, that basically there was a constriction of demand, which the media pointed out stretched from biscuits to automobiles and elsewhere, that therefore the state needed to come and intervene in order to in fact even generate for the private sector, for big capital, some kind of provide some kind of a demand stimulus, so that you would see a revival of growth and of course profitability for these sections, which in some sense have contributed in multiple ways to supporting and shoring up the state. Now the thing is, in September, when we were observing this deceleration in growth, when there were significant demands that the state should now intervene, not merely from progressive forces or democratic elements and in mass movements and people's movements, etc., but from big business as well, that the government should intervene by undertaking significant expenditures which would inject demand into the system. What we saw was the finance minister decides to come on board and declare a significant and massive tax concession, which brought down by 10 percentage points, subject to the fact that you don't then take make use of any tax concessions or benefits. You basically saw a 10% decline in the effective rate of tax placed on the highest level as far as corporate taxes were concerned. There was a huge corporate tax concession which was given, such that what we saw is a major shrinking of tax revenues. So if we compare the tax revenue which was actually mobilized according to estimates from the Controller General of Accounts during the 2019-2020 period, that last financial year, it was not merely 19% allowing for some adjustments. Let's say 15% short of the projections which were made in the first NDA in budget of the NDA government, and subsequently in the budget which was presented by the finance minister in February, the revised estimates showed that actually the shortfall relative to our own curtailed estimates in her budget, as opposed to the first budget, which should have been a vote on account of the NDA government, that the actual reduction was to the tune of about 10%. So you had a 10% shortfall in net tax revenues, or tax revenues adjusted for payment of returns. You actually had a significant squeeze of the fiscal power, and therefore you saw that if you look at the revenue shortfall, it meant that the center's revenue receipts in 2019-20 grew by just about 3% relative to the previous year, which means in real terms, there was a huge shrinking of the overall revenue receipts because of the fall which was observed in terms from 18.5 lakh crores to about 16.8 lakh crores. Now that was in the last financial year. Now, obviously, one of the things to have done once the pandemic struck, when it was very clear that the government needed to ramp up expenditures, it needed to ramp up expenditures not merely in order to test, treat, and isolate. It needed to ramp up expenditures in order to protect its health workers, its doctors. It needed to ramp up expenditures to ring fence essential sectors such that economic activity of a minimum level should continue. And it needed to ramp up expenditures in order to provide support to those who had lost their incomes and their livelihoods, both as wage earners as well as those getting earnings as self-employed or small and medium enterprises, and of course provide them with not just with transfers which can allow them to stay in place till such point of time as the recovery occurs. When you needed to undertake that kind of an expenditure, an increase in expenditure, what was really happening to revenues? Well, what was happening to revenues is, if you look at the first 4 months of this year, which is from April to July of 2020-21, which is the latest estimates we have from the CGA, the Controller General of Accounts, what we find is revenue receipts amount now to just 7.5% over these 4 months of the total budgeted revenue receipts in the budget for financial year 2020-21. When if you take in a period of the previous financial year where things were already getting bad, it was about 15%. So you're getting half of what was already a bad revenue receipt situation because of the effect of the pandemic and the fact that you are not doing very much in order to be able to deal with the shrinkage of revenues. One thing, for example, which could have been done, that just as much as there's been talk of trying to make adjustments in terms of not providing, let us say, the increases in incomes which should be provided because of the need to pay DNS allowance which fell due for central government employees and state government employees, etc., particularly as far as the center was concerned, the central government employees, just as much as you were willing to delay certain things, you could have said that, listen, at the minimum, we want to hold back on the huge direct tax concession, corporate tax concession, which we gave in September, such that we can mobilize money, the resources to be able to deal with what is an unprecedented external shock, which has come as a result of this pandemic, as a result of the coronavirus. But you're not willing to do all of that, such that what is happening is that a combination of what was a bad situation because of an engineered fiscal crisis gets worse because of the slowdown in growth. And in as much as you do very little to address that, you obviously would have a situation in which things would get even worse because of the fact that growth would shrink. And we know that growth is going to shrink significantly, which would obviously shrink revenue collections. Now, one area in which that has become, quite visible, of course, is in the area of GST, where GST collections were not merely bad last year, but are terrible this year. And the center, rather than actually finding ways, as the finance minister from Kerala pointed out, of addressing this problem, perhaps through going in for borrowing, which can then be repaid, actually decides to say that there is no money in the kitty, so we can't even compensate for the states for something which we had promised them, which was a 14% increase in revenues from GST that they would get. So in essence, what you're doing is you're saying that I'm not going to mobilize resources in order to be able to undertake expenditures in a period of time when I need to ramp up expenditures hugely, so that you would end up with a situation where unless you can mobilize by some, unusual maneuver in a period of time when the economy is shrinking, is in a state of deep crisis, you would actually see a huge curtailment of expenditures, a huge fall in growth, and a huge worsening of the fiscal crisis. Now, what could be this alternative direction in which the state would tend to go? Well, one would have been to try and get the Reserve Bank of India to give it a large amount of resources. That has not been possible because even after getting the Reserve Bank of India to transfer a special dividend, that amounts to only 51,000 crores this year, which is much less than what it got by using up all the surpluses which were lying with the Reserve Bank of India in the past, which happened in the previous financial year. So you can't get it very much from there. You obviously then have to look in terms of selling assets which could be sold in the current context. And it's going to be very difficult to get decent prices for assets, even good assets, public assets at this point of time, so that even though you provided for a significant amount to be mobilized through sale of public sector enterprises, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to do it definitely within the early part of this year and perhaps over the year as a whole. Where possibly there's going to be an attempt to try and take a major step forward is to try and get not just the 90,000 crores which were put into the budget, but even more by privatizing the public banking system. We know, for example, that ICICI Bank has just now gone to market and picked up 15,000 crores because international finance is waiting to take over banking assets in this country, and particularly it would be waiting to take over public banking assets because these public banks hold a significant amount of government securities and therefore to a certain extent are insured, have got a sovereign guarantee which comes from fact that they have an asset position in terms of government securities sitting on their books. So if you decide to actually begin to implement that threat of getting 90,000 crores you had set in the budget, but much more, that is the only direction they can go to try and resolve this crisis which they have engineered. On the surface, they of course claim, and I'll just make this last point, they of course claim that this is not the way we're going to try and do it. The way we're going to try and do it is we're going to try and inject liquidity into the system. So if you looked at the first response, the first macroeconomic response we got, it was that in an off-cycle meeting of the central bank's monetary policy committee, it was decided to cut the interest rate by 75 basis points, and in fact, points, and to bring it down by 0.75%. It was decided that there's going to be a huge increase in liquidity in order to shore up lending to the non-bank financial companies as well as to big companies, which is going to be in some sense backed by the central bank. The banking system was asked to lend, and the central bank said that besides reducing your cash reserve ratio, we're going to release additional liquidity. And finally, you said that there's going to be a small amount of money which we're going to provide to medium and small enterprises. Of those entities which had already borrowed, had been making payments and therefore had not been declared as defaulters, you would provide them with an additional 25%, and that would be guaranteed. The banks would get a guarantee from the government. So you're really taking a small component of the MSME sector and telling them that, listen, okay, we're going to give you additional money since you borrowed money in the past, you returned this money, and we're going to tell the banks to lend to you, and we're going to try and push them. But that is the only area in which the state itself was backing the banking system. The rest was left to the banking system and the central bank to do, infuse liquidity and push credit. That was the major component of using monetary policy as the mechanism which would be a substitute for fiscal policy in the middle of a crisis. Now, in some sense, the perception here is that this is a supply side crisis. It's the lack of access to money which has resulted in the crisis, and not a demand side crisis. That is lack of purchasing power, as was pointed out, for people to go out there and buy because they've lost their incomes, their livelihoods, etc., which can only be resolved by a significant degree of expansion, substantial expansion of expenditure by the state. But you're not willing to do that unless, of course, as I said, you ended up with the government selling some of its biggest and most successful public sector banks and getting, they hope, maybe more than the 90,000 crores that they expected to get. Now, the last point I want to make is that one argument which could be put forth, I mean, Professor Patnaik pointed to the fact that we can think of taxes, a wealth tax and inheritance tax, which can generate enough resources to undertake expenditures which will not only deliver significant human development benefits, but also push demand and growth in the system. But supposing it is said that, listen, we are in the middle of a deep crisis, and in the middle of a deep crisis, which affects also big business, etc., we can't actually go around imposing taxes. Then the thing to do, since in any case, you're sitting on $538 billion of foreign exchange reserves, huge food grain stocks, far in excess of the buffer that you need. The thing to do is to just go to the central bank and tell the central bank that, listen, please print money and lend it to me such that I can undertake expenditures. You monetize your deficit, undertake these expenditures. If you undertake those expenditures, then the crisis, the fiscal crisis you're facing would be partly resolved. Your GST revenues would improve. Your direct tax revenues would improve. And if you withdraw the huge tax concession that you gave to the corporate sector in September last year, that would be even better. You would actually get a significantly better picture as far as your budgetary position is concerned. And then you can, as things begin to get better, impose these additional taxes, these wealth taxes, these inheritance taxes, other corporate taxes, and other income taxes on the super rich, etc. Mobilize the money and ensure that we see a recovery, even while the public banking system is still there to keep alive a whole trajectory in which it contributed significantly to financing growth, to making that growth more inclusive by ensuring a certain degree of horizontal and vertical inclusion in the distribution of credit, and did it all with a substantial degree of stability of the banking system. So you actually have to protect that and not use it as an excuse and make it do things when it's sitting on large non-performing assets which were engineered as a result of forcing them to lend to the giant mega infrastructure projects which the private sector was forced into investing in. Then obviously you're not going to be in a situation to resolve this crisis. So I do think this is the direction of spending on the basis of borrowing and subsequent taxation, which the state should adopt, and this should be something which this parliament should push for. Thank you.
Professor, CP Chandrasekhar, it was really, really great. Thank you so much. I mean, you made it very clear that the fiscal crisis is engineered through some of the steps that the government has taken to favor some of the corporates and the rich, and even the ways in which they are trying to kind of generate revenue by selling the public sector units and privatizing the public sector banks. I mean, that's also going to be damaging for the economy in the long run. I now call the next speaker, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta. Mr. Paranjoy is a former editor of Economic and Political Weekly, an independent educator and journalist based in Delhi, whose work cut across different media, print, radio, television, documentary, cinema, and internet. Over to you, Paranjoy.
Thank you, Joe. You can put the video on.
I think you will have to do it yourself.
Okay, I put it on. It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Nachiket, can you please? Yes.
Yeah,
yes, now you can.
Hello.
Now you can switch on your video, sir.
Achha, you're telling me? All right, I'll now switch it on. Thank you.
Yes, you are visible, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to, I can see there are 111 participants in this Zoom meeting. And I will try and add to what has already been said by the speakers before me. And the topic that has been given to me is the nexus between corporates, governments, and bureaucrats. And I'm going to try and illustrate my brief presentations with as many examples as I can in the time that has been allotted to me, which is about 10 minutes. Now, crony capitalism in India is nothing new. It's been there for a long, long time. In fact, many have argued that capitalism, by its very nature, leads to crony capitalism. So a lot of people don't differentiate between these two, don't make crony capitalism a separate kind of category. However, others believe that crony capitalism is not really different from certain kind. It is, sorry, I beg your pardon, that crony capitalism is in fact different from other kinds of capitalism, in the sense that the playing field is not level. And if you are close to the powers that be, politicians, civil servants, then you get unfair advantage. The state, the government gives you unfair advantages. So without getting into this debate at length, what I'm going to argue in the course of this presentation is that we in India, especially over the last few years, are moving from crony capitalism to a kind of oligarchy. So even within the capitalists, within or among capitalists, we are finding particular capitalists being given an unfair advantage over others. And I'm going to illustrate my presentation with two examples about the two richest men in India, both of whose surnames begin with the first letter of the English alphabet, and no prizes for guessing their name. But before I begin that bit of the presentation, let me just step back a little bit and argue that our first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, wanted India to have a mixed economy. He said he hoped that India would be able to incorporate the best elements of both capitalism and socialism and communism. His critics argued that this is not going to work, and what we instead are going to have, instead of a mixed economy, a mixed up economy. Many have argued, including Professor Amartya Sen, that many in India took the worst of both worlds. That we took the worst of capitalism and the worst of the most authoritarian regimes who call themselves socialist or communist. But what was common among, say, the Russia, the erstwhile Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and smaller countries like Vietnam and Cuba, is that they provided for healthcare and education to the bulk of its population. Now, we in India failed miserably in that regard. And many argue that, when you talk about quote unquote free enterprise capitalism and providing a level playing field, many argue that instead what we had was a so-called license control permit Raj, to use Chakrabarti Rajgopalachari, Nehru's political and ideological opponent, his phrase. Along the way, somewhere the differences between what was public and what was private got blurred. The public sector often became the private fiefdoms of netas and babus, the political leaders and the bureaucrats in power. And the private sector was often run with capital, both working capital and long-term capital provided by government-owned financial institutions and banks. And when Swaraj Paul mounted these hostile takeover bids to try and destabilize the managements of escorts and DCM, the fact came to the fore that promoters had really a minuscule share of the equity capital of the larger corporate conglomerates that they would control. Now, post 1991, we saw changes. But before that, the private sector, as happened in many other countries in the world, could never have been able to achieve what it did if it hadn't been for, in a sense, the losses and the subsidies provided by the public sector. So this blurring of the private and the public, or what we claimed was a public and what we claimed was private, took place over a period of time. After 1991, the so-called period of economic liberalization, we saw the rise of different forms of crony capitalism. And we saw privatization getting a big thrust, especially during the Vajpayee regime. And among the most dominant examples of that was when we created a private monopoly in the petrochemical sector. When IPCL, the Indian Petrochemicals Corporation Limited, the government allowed Reliance Industries to take it over, thereby giving it a more than 95% share of a wide range of petrochemical products, from high density polyethylene to every kind of plastic product, polypropylene, and so on and so forth. The difference between a public monopoly, or sometimes called a natural monopoly, and a private monopoly is that governments change, regimes change, bureaucrats change, politicians lose elections, but in a private monopoly, the promoters, the families, often families that control private corporate conglomerates, they continue to hold it. Therefore, the Ambani family from the 90s, actually the late 90s, have monopolized this big segment of the petrochemicals industry. So this is one example I gave. And what we really saw in the last years of the Narasimha Rao regime, when telecommunications moved into the private sector, and we found again under Sukram different kinds of cronyism happening. The movement from the license fee regime to the revenue sharing regime, and the high turnover of telecom ministers, all of which sort of culminated in what was in the first UPA government, the so-called 2G spectrum scam, where a scarce natural resource, that's electromagnetic spectrum used for mobile communications, was given on a first come first served basis and resulted in a huge uproar. We saw something similar happening in the case of coal, and these two big scandals, which were adversely commented upon by the Controller and Auditor General of India, did contribute a great deal towards, in fact, the demise of the UPA government, and that was a factor that we had to keep in mind as we move on. Now, let's look a little bit at Reliance, and then I talk a little bit about Adani. Today, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, who heads Reliance Industries Limited, is not just India's richest man. He happens to be Asia's richest man. He happens to be among the world's, well, among the top 10 of the richest men in the world, if you believe Forbes and Fortune and these publications. Then essentially they draw their rankings on the basis of market capitalization. That means the price of the share multiplied by the number of shares at any given particular point of time. It may not be exactly the best measure, but this is the way these organizations, they rank individuals. Now, Mr. Mukesh Ambani's father, Mr. Dhirubhai Ambani, he also believed in managing the environment. And when he died without a will and his two sons fought, we really saw that one of the important reasons for the fight between the siblings was not so much because their wives didn't get along with each other. Nita and Tina may not have been the best of friends, but essentially it was one of the big battles that they fought was to grab natural gas that belongs to the people of this country from the Krishna Godavari basin. And we saw under the UPA regime worst forms of cronyism in the manner in which the government changed its rules, its regulations, the way the regulatory authorities work to help the conglomerate headed by the richest man in India. Now we see that process continuing into the Modi regime. And what we saw was, again, if we look at the telecom area, we found a kind of like a regulatory capture happening, where the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, instead of being an impartial, balanced regulator, was actually playing favorites. And the way in which a small, nondescript company acquired broadband wireless access spectrum, which was in turn acquired by Reliance, enabled it in a span of a very short period of time. I mean, Reliance Jio was nowhere in early 2016. By the end of 2019, it had become the biggest player in telecommunications, and it's not just telecommunications, in mobile internet data service provider. It became the biggest mobile data service provider. It started free. It's a classic case of what you would describe as predatory behavior or predatory pricing, which the Competition Commission of India did not acknowledge. Now we have here, when regulatory authorities act in a manner that appears to be complicit with particular organizations, we have this kind of cronyism, we have this kind of oligarchy. And more recently, the judgment by the bench headed by Justice Arun Mishra in the AGR, or the adjusted gross revenues case, which has been pending for more than a decade, I think 12 or 13 years, the implication of that judgment was to essentially marginalize the competition, marginalize Sunil Bharti Mittal, Idea Vodafone, and of course, Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited and Mahanagar Telephone Limited have been pushed to the margins. So here we had a sector which had at one point of time 15 players. You can say there were too many players, that none of those players could have survived. But we've been brought it down to an oligopoly, which is led by the newcomer, which is Reliance Jio. And at a time when the economy has been devastated, you've heard what Professor Chandrasekhar, Professor Patnaik and others have said, at a time when India's economy is shrinking, it's been devastated, you have the world's biggest social media giant, that's Facebook, and how it's been complicit with the BJP is another story. But this Facebook starts investing big bucks, billions of dollars in Reliance Jio, as does Google, as does Intel, as does a whole lot of people. So we have documented how the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, the Securities and Exchange Board of India have actually tweaked rules. And the biggest beneficiary has been Reliance Jio. We've documented how the State Bank of India, India's biggest bank, how it became a 30% owner in a joint venture with Reliance Jio, where there was clear conflicts of interest. We had the former chairman and managing director of the State Bank of India, Mrs. Arundhati Bhattacharya, joining the board of Reliance as a quote-unquote independent director soon after her cooling period got over. Now, this was a classic case of the old analogy, as we pointed out in an article that we've written for NewsClick. is the classic case of the camel in the tent. The master of the camel, it takes pity on the camel on a cold winter night, and he said, well, you can bring your nose in, and then you bring your mouth, your face in, and then the camel gets inside the net and tells the owner, look, this tent is too small for both of us. You go out, you're the smaller guy. So I'm not sure whether this is going to happen, but the manner in which India's biggest bank has gone in for this joint venture raises more than a few questions. If we briefly now talk about the second richest man in India, Mr. Adani, very few people knew him 20 years ago. Today, he's not just the second richest man in India. The kind of control he exercises over crucial sectors of the economy and the infrastructure sector of the economy is amazing. And I'll just highlight a few examples because this is again a long story. I'm working on a book on the subject. What we found is that Adani is the biggest generator of electricity using coal in the private sector. It is also the biggest generator of electricity using solar energy in the private sector. It is the biggest transmitter of electricity. And after it took over the younger brother Ambani's distribution business in Mumbai, it is also the biggest distributor of electricity. The Adani Group is the biggest importer of coal to India. It is the biggest operator of coal mines in India. It intends setting up one of the world's largest greenfield projects in Australia, where because of strong pressure from civil society in that country, the project is down to 1/5 of its originally envisaged site. That's not all. Adani Group owns the biggest special economic zone, the biggest private port. It's soon overtaken the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust in Nhava Sheva as the biggest container port. It has like the proverbial string of pearls, which China is supposed to have from the South China Sea to the Horn of Africa. Adani's string of jewels or string of pearls, they're all across the west coast and the east coast of India. Its recent acquisition in Krishnapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, and it's the biggest logistic firm. That's not all. Before there was a reorganization within the family, it was the biggest aggregator of cut and polished diamonds and export of gold jewelry in India. It's the biggest distributor of imported edible oils, palmolive, largely from Indonesia and Malaysia, the Fortune brand. It's a major importer of apples. It's a major player in real estate. It has got big into data storage. It's setting up with the Israeli firm a company to make drones, also called unmanned aerial vehicles. Importantly, and this is again a new development, under the new regime, it hopes to become the biggest private operator of airports in this country. It's not been successful in gaining managerial control because of the pandemic. It sought for more time. And the last point I want to make, perhaps it's not a coincidence that Justice Arun Kumar Mishra, the senior most in terms of age judge in the Supreme Court of India, he's retired. He's going to be retiring in early September. I beg your pardon, I stand corrected. There's clear documentation on how 6 judgments have been given by benches headed by Justice Arun Mishra, which has enabled the Adani Group to gain to the tune of tens of thousands of crores. And this has been flagged by various people, including senior advocate Dushyant Dave. So this is just a kind of a big picture, a snapshot of how India has moved from a mixed economy to a rightward shift under economic liberalization to cronyism, and now we are seeing the oligarchy at work. And Akhil Bilgrami in a public speech wondered why, and I'm quoting him, I'm not saying, he said, why 2 Gujarati businessmen are getting everything? Why aren't the others protesting? Good question. I don't have the answer to that question. Thank you very much, Joe, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Enjoy for that. I mean, telling us the story of growth of two A's from Gujarat in the past few years. How we are moving or moved already from crony capitalism to oligarchy. I'll move on to the next speaker now, Mr. K. Raghunandan. He is the convener of the Consortium of Indian Associations and a former president of All India Manufacturers Organization. Over to you, Mr. Raghu.
Thank you, Mr. Joe. And friends, it's been difficult to speak on economy in this current situation, and it's much more difficult to speak after we heard the excellent speeches in the last 1 hour. Let me try and do my justice. Comrade Franco is known for a frank deliberations. That's why God named him as a Franco. I am not an economist, but as an entrepreneur, if I look at what is economy, I'm trying to define economy for me. As an entrepreneur, I look at economy means profit in my hands, which I can use it for my expansion or for my diversification or for my risk-taking projects. Money in the hands of my employees means long-term investments for their life and a short-term pleasures of their living. The last 5 months, COVID obviously has struck us like a lightning. Was it only COVID which struck us? Question mark. We have been ailing for the last 3 years in this country. Entrepreneurs have been struggling between conventional business models versus digitalized business models. We suddenly became an alien in the Indian entrepreneurial journey. I have been a businessman for 35 years. When I started, there was no mobile phones. And today, without a mobile phone, you can't do business. I have seen how the technology advancements has led us. But still, the last 5 years has been too fast a journey. It was been a roller coaster drive. Coping up even for an entrepreneur was very difficult. We understand that intentions, methodologies, we have talked enough on all those manners, but limiting ourselves to the COVID now, this is something which universally, geographically, size-wise, every enterprise or an individual or an entrepreneur have suffered. Today we open the paper. There are only two informations we see. The weak side of an entrepreneur, who are micro and small enterprises, who are normally given loans against security. The advertisements on auction sale notices and possession notices. The other side, the stronger side of corporates, who have taken money in lakhs of crores or thousands of crores, are being written off, or being let off, or being allowed to further save on. Today, micro and small entrepreneurs for the last 5 months crying, 5 lakhs crore is due from the corporates. Who is paying? Where is the money? The only recourse what we used to have with that corporate giant was to threaten them that I will take them into IBC. Now that also from 1 lakh, we have upped to 1 crore as a limit or a threshold for going to the IBC. Then where do I go? There is no alternative for me to redress my problems. When any situation, we cope up. I don't agree. We need to understand the problems. We need to face the problem. We need to come out of the problems. So there are always 4 types of decisions which we make in any situation. Applies to you, applies to me. Right decision, wrong decision, short decisions, no decisions. Now, there are certain roles which an entrepreneur plays. In the last 5 months, when my hands are tied, when my legs are tied, when my business is shuttered down, I came back from the factory on 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. I was told I cannot go back to my factory from the next day. I went to the factory after nearly 150th day, which I have never in my life of 35 years has happened. Even when we not able to go to the factory, there are days I have come back from US after a business trip in the night at 11:30, gone from the airport directly to my factory because I can sleep only after I see the factory. Everything is all right. We were curtailed. So there is hardly anything which we can do because the decisions are short from the central ministry or from the state ministry or from the district administration. Some states suddenly said it's an unlock period. Some states suddenly call, still it is a locking period. Some states say you can move anywhere within the state. Some states say even within a city you cannot move. I don't understand how do we cope up with it, but fair enough. Every time we play the ball and go near the goalpost gets shifted. So how many right decisions were made, how many wrong decisions were made, and how many short decisions were made? If we really analyze in the last 5 months, from 24th of March, when the lockdown started, till today, there has been only one stimulus package which was continuously announced in the press for a period of 4 days. That was in June middle. 3 lakh crore scheme came, supposed to be helping MSME. And even after 2 months, we are not able to pedal more than 30% of dispersals. Instead of looking what is stopping, we have enlarged the base, take for everybody. We talked about few other opportunities which were coming into the hands, MSME reclassification. Then we suddenly talked about Chinese ban. We talked about boycotting Chinese products. Then we talked about privatizations. Then we talk about foreign investments enhancements. This country in the last 2 years, even a child will know that there has been a problem with specifically few industries. Automobile was one, real estate was one, tanneries were third, textiles were the fourth. We have been having issues. What issues we have? One is regulatory issues. Second is market-related offtakes. Did we handle that well? Did we try and resolve them back? We have not. So who got hurt? If we say real estate is not doing well, there is a host of service providers to the real estate market who are all hit. Finally, who takes the beating? It's the entrepreneur, micro enterprises, self-employed entrepreneurs. They have been taking the beatings. Did we do anything for them? We have actually not. We play with words. We play with wisdoms. We play with debates. We coin new names of everything. We say this is all common with every country. This is something which it has to happen. And some people will obviously won't be able to cope up. They have to die. Fair enough. If somebody has to die, I'm talking self-employed entrepreneurs, if they have to die, do we just leave them or do we give them honorable cremations? Today, we don't even have an exit route. We don't have an exit route. And there is no way I will be able to survive. So what do I do? How do I come out of it? What is NPA? Non-performing asset. A non-performing asset during the month of March 1st, can it remain a non-performing asset same in the month of August? Things have changed. Things have changed. Do we want to think out of box or we are wanting to think out of the world? Do we think from our head and take decisions? Do we think from our heart and make decisions? Both are necessary. Look at migrant labor. Are we not reading? Today morning, are we not reading? 50 million people or 50 lakhs people have lost jobs in the last 1 month, or 1.5 crores employment loss in the last 4 months. A bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. Everybody knows. But where is the bird? Where is the opportunity? Are we realizing the problem? Yes, it's easy to talk positivity. But if we don't talk truth, how will we find solution? If everybody only claps, saying we have handled well, today COVID is also unmanageable, economy is also unmanageable. Where are we standing now? Where is the 20 lakhs crore? How much we have spent? How much is yet to spend? Who has been benefited? Who has been able to cross over? Have I taken the clock of my asset 10 years back or 20 years back? Some people come and cry to me. All their resources which they earned in the last 20 years have been wiped out in the last 4 months. Painful? It's painful. It's easy for the people who have an air-conditioned bedroom to live separately, with a TV, with a Wi-Fi connectivity, with a Netflix and Amazon Prime to watch movies, with a fat bank balance to live. It's easy to get confinement. It's easy to be quarantined. It is easy to live within your four walls. Think of the people who are walking on the roads, who are living with four walls, 10 people. Easy? Not easy, my friends. But what has happened to the brains of this country? What happened to the intelligence of this country? Is there a ear? Is there a tongue? Gone. Today, in industry, what is becoming popular now? Small scale entrepreneurs, we have gone back to bartering days. What is barter? Those days we used to hear when the money was not invented, people used to barter. Today we have gone back to the bartering days. Because I don't have cash flow in the market. People who want to give me orders don't have money to pay me. And the bank doesn't want to lend me. I have to survive. Survival of the fittest. I am bartering. Do you think I have become 21st century, 22nd century now? No, I have taken by century backwards. Do we realize that? On top of it, added natural calamities, rain, landslides, disruptions, petrol prices, diesel prices have gone up. Not able to make the ends meet. We have been stretched beyond the elasticity. Today we are worried how to close. Do you want to see more Siddharthas in this market? Have you ever thought? I have 35 years, I have worked, I am 60 years old. I have been as an entrepreneur for 35 years, sleeping only for 6 hours a day, taken risks, lost money, but fought my life. Great entrepreneurial lifestyle I have led. Where am I today? Weeping, crying, because I go to the bank and ask them for the credit guarantee scheme. They say, your business has not improved in the last 2 years. Please repay what I have already lent to you. I don't know what are we talking. Are we being carried away? I will become a saint. Preachers. You know, preachers don't practice. I don't want to get into who is right, who is wrong. I am a patient. I cry with the pain. I need the doctors to attend to me. Do whatever you want with my body, but give me relief from the pain. But somebody come and tell me, hey, it's easy to criticize. Give me suggestions. What suggestion a patient can give? Tell me. I've been a honest taxpayer. 4 months. I've lost everything. What am I going to get back in my life? How am I going to rebuild myself? How will I lead the team again back into the society? Exporters are suffocating. You know, the Chinese ban came. Suddenly, some shipment customs duty at Chennai, they said go slow on clearing Chinese imports. In Tirupur market, 30% of the orders got cancelled because those who imported buttons and zips from China could not get it out of their material in time from the customs. Do we achieve Atmanirbhar in overnight, or do we achieve over a period of a time? Lockdown can be announced in few hours, no issues. But to give a birth of a child, you need 10 months. How do we sustain? Isn't it simple to open a website by the government and ask the enterprises to log in onto 3 categories? Category A, who are not impacted, continue to do well. Category B, who are impacted but have a potential to do well. Category 3, who feel they have lost their business opportunity, they will not be able to continue with their business. And then devise a strategy, what I should do for them, what I should do for them, what I should do for them. If there is an accident and if there are 20 people who got injured in the accident, do we attend to all of them? Or do I make rationed support? I was sad to see, I was pained to see all the entrepreneurs are crying for money. Few days back, we got the announcement from RBI saying those who are eligible with this can come and avail this benefit. In giving water to the thirsty people's mouth, do you want to put eligibility criteria? Are we not inhuman? Tell me. Think. All of you are great people of this country. I know which platform I am talking now. I am not a leftist. I am not a rightist. I am an entrepreneur. I understand the pains of the COVID. I lost 2 of my closest relatives in the COVID. My mother and my wife tell me, don't go out at all, Raghu. Safeguard yourself, you have reached 60. Do you think I am able to stay like this? Not at all. I am going and giving the cash, whatever I could, to my employees across the place. I am risking my own life because I know the pains of theirs. Education has gone for a sixer. Revival of the business has gone for a sixer. My banking systems have gone for a sixer. My methodology of doing business has gone for a sixer with swapping. And we talk about somebody raising 45,000 crores in terms of share markets. Painful? It is. It is. If I go to a funeral, I'll go in a small casual dress with a black color to show my solidarity. I will not go with a band. Painful, my dear. What crime I have done? I'm talking as an entrepreneur. I'm representing Confederation of the small enterprises across the country. I hear weeping tones. I hear painful tears. I use this platform in communicating the pain. Don't pass me off. Don't think I am exaggerating. Nothing wrong even if I exaggerate. But please solve. You are not making right decision. You are not making shortfall decisions are being made. You are not looking at where you need to make right decisions. Please, will I ever sell something or do I ever now do privatizing? Will I get a good value for my money? Tell me. Very difficult to digest. I'm waiting for the suggestions. I'm waiting to hear from each one of you. Mr. Joe, thank you for the opportunity. Comrade Franco, once again, grateful to you for giving a platform for venting out the tears. We never cry openly. Today we cry openly. If you pierce my eyes through, you will see the tears. If you pierce my heart, you will see the blood. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ravi, Raghu, for sharing the sorry state of MSMEs in India now, one of the key backbones of the economy. I call upon the next speaker, Pooja Parvati. She's the India Country Manager of International Budget Partnership. Over to you, Pooja.
Thank you, Joe. I'm on the part of this session. Known, they merit repetition, especially now when the COVID crisis has allowed the union government room to reset priorities without adequate scrutiny by Parliament or consultation with state governments and others. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll also try and flag a few points about budget utilization, transparency, accountability, and the need for addressing implementation challenges in social sector programs. In these times of very fast-moving, highly perishable news cycle, the average person would have consumed and forgotten the findings of an Oxfam research last year that showed that billionaires' fortunes increased by 35% in just last year, while 13 crore Indians remain indebted. Professor Patnaik also alluded and talked about it very beautifully. So what's the takeaway from this? If one digs deeper, it points to an ever-increasing wealth gap due to a poorly developed social sector, thanks mostly to government apathy. The union government, irrespective of which party is ruling, has always been stingy in making allocations for the social sector. The UPA followed a conservative fiscal policy as it was constrained by a low tax to GDP ratio, which meant that the social sector was attention and allocations that it needed. The NDA too has followed this policy with great rigor. So since 2012, commentators have observed how there is a sort of a systematic policy incongruence between budget allocations and the government policy, particularly in the health and education sectors, which seem to be bearing the brunt of fiscal consolidation. Let me briefly highlight the trends from the budgets of the past few years. The 2014-15 union budget, also the NDA's first, prioritized defense, road transport, and highways over critical sectors like WCD, tribal affairs, health and family welfare, and youth affairs. Now, one would have expected things would improve in the following year when the government would have, presumably settled down in office. The next budget, which was 2015-16, did contain key announcements on insurance, pension, and tax concessions for healthcare. While these were categorized as social security measures, it doesn't take a lot to see through the smoke screen, where the provision of these services were outsourced to the private sector and intended to bolster India Inc. In the same year, tax on companies was cut from 30% to 25%, ostensibly to boost investment and increase productivity in the economy. But that was, of course, not to be. Demonetization in November 2016 created demand in the economy and disrupted investments, thereby denying the government any sort of revenue windfall. And
Pooja?
before we could even, yeah.
Pooja, there is a request from the translators to go a bit slow. They are translating it simultaneously, so please go slow. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, and it was just around that time that demonetization happened in November 2016 that created the demand in the economy and disrupted investments. And it denied the government any sort of revenue windfall that it was expecting that would happen. And before we could even recover from the effects of the note ban, the hastily sort of, that was done overnight, a new regime of international indirect taxation, which was the goods and services tax, was introduced in 2017. Now, again, the chaotic rollout of GST led to a total disruption of production and supply chain. And we've heard a lot about that being explained by the previous speakers. I just want to refer here to the note ban and the GST, primarily because these policy decisions were intended to result in a sort of a revenue windfall. At least that was the sort of, position that was made, given that giving the money to the government money to pay for social sector programs. But that what happened and how it ended was it actually had the exact opposite effect. Last year, again, when the revenue was crumbling and the government should have taxed the rich, instead, it cut corporate tax. And we heard about that. Professor Chandrasekhar talked about it. So that companies were encouraged to leave China and come to India. Of course, that didn't happen. And we lost money in the process. And what we ideally, what was owed to the country's children in terms of for their education, for their health, nutrition, mothers' education, health and nutrition, all of that suffered. And then the coronavirus outbreak turned into a pandemic. This was around the time. So while the trade war and the virus were beyond the Indian administration's control, the note ban and the GST, hastily sort of implemented GST, were results of our policy decisions, our union government's policy decisions. And speakers before me have also spoken about how the disruptions caused by the pandemic squeezed government's revenue, both through tax collections and asset sales. But the problem of declining social sector allocations has been one that's existed much before the COVID-19 outbreak, something which again Professor Patnaik did speak about. To know what's being spent on the social sector, one only needs to look at the numbers. So the total union budget expenditure as percent of GDP fell from 13.3% in 14-15 to 12.2% in 18-19. In the last 2 years, it was 13.2% and 13.5% respectively. But these are, largely approximations, and we will need to look at the audited numbers. And interestingly, in a recent union government advisory of April 2020, of the 100 union ministries and departments listed in the advisory, 52 of them have been instructed to keep their spending within 15% of 2021 budgeted estimate in the first quarter. So all the critical ministries, such as the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Tribal Affairs, WCD, Minority Affairs, all of these fall within this 22 list. Another aspect worth flagging is the attention or the lack of given to the marginalized sections of population. While there is a renewed focus on assessing responsiveness of budgets towards women and children, this has not been the case for the other, extended to the other marginalized groups such as Dalits, Adivasis, persons with disabilities, transgender people, and religious minorities. In fact, even the focus on gender budgeting is limited to a binary frame of gender and leaves out transgender people. If we just take the case of gender budgeting, the union government's gender budget statement captures, as some of us would know, budgets earmarked for women and girls. From 2008-9 to 13-14, the gender budget rose from 5.5% to 6.11% of the total union budget allocations. However, from 14-15 to 2021, this has remained between 4.88% to 4.71% of the total union budget allocations. Moving on, if we look at the expenditure on social services as a percent of GDP for both union and all states combined, this has increased only marginally from 6.2% in 14-15 to 7.7% in 19-20 budgeted estimates. So implications of this lack of focus on social sectors hits the states the hardest as it affects program implementation. Even more so now with the need to spend more due to the COVID crisis. And despite this, it is the states which have fared better than the union government in terms of increasing allocations for the social sector. So, a quick analysis of the available data from union government and all states reveals that the percentage change in increase of year-on-year allocations for social sector remains higher for all states combined as compared to the union government. So that goes against the mainstream discourse that apportions all the blame on the states for low allocations. And if at all the states are unable to allocate more to social sector programs, which is something again that some of the experts did allude to and speak about earlier, this is mostly because the programs are designed by the union government with rigid guidelines and conditionalities, and which are attached to the center state resource sharing. Now, where does the money come from? A lot has already been said, but I would like to flag a couple of points here. Of course, coming back to one of the key reasons for neglect of social sector spending, India's low tax to GDP ratio remains a key reason. And at 11.2%, it is, or a little more than that maybe now, it's lower than Kenya, Lebanon, and Malawi, just to name a few countries. Also, how resources are mobilized and how much is shared with the states is also something that is important to kind of examine. So as of 2021, the union government's tax collection has seen the slowest pace of growth since the global financial crisis of 2008. And we also heard about how the GST collections have fallen short of what was the sort of monthly target set for about rupees 1 lakh crore a month in the last 2 years. The interim recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission that the state's share be 41% would seem to suggest that the resources available to states might not have dropped drastically, and it's not going to really impact them so much. However, this is more of a case of sleight of hand, because what the union government gives with one hand, it takes away from the other. So the GST law, about which we also heard Comrade Thomas Isaac speak about, I'll just mention the fact that the Finance Secretary in the Parliamentary Standing Committee meeting that was held in July 2020 on finance, he did clearly mention that now there is no money to provide states their GST share. And then, of course, there are taxes that do not get shared, such as the cess, surcharge, special excise duty on petrol, etc., which when coupled with the sort of limited avenues available for states to mobilize resources, they obviously will be constrained to spend adequately and then end up defaulting on their share of the allocations for critical social sector schemes and programs. And also now, again, it's all about conditionalities. So the union government's decision to link Niti Aayog's tracking of states' performance across key sectors to build the SDG index, link it with the financing of social sector programs, will only aggravate the already ailing sort of fiscal health of the states. So inadequate allocations comprises one part of the problem. The other equally critical one is about its utilization. So for example, at the end of the first quarter, Ministry of Education, now it's not MHRD anymore, and MSJE are mostly able to utilize only 15% and 14% of their budgets respectively as per the Controller General Accounts estimates. And utilization picks up only by the fourth quarter. So due to this, the quality of expenditure also gets affected. One solution could be multi-year budgeting, which economists have suggested that in the current crisis, the government can take this extraordinary decision. So the International Budget Partnership's open budget survey that ranks countries across the world on various parameters of transparency and openness, accountability, etc., also finds that one of the major weaknesses of the budgetary system in India is the absence of multi-year budgeting. So multi-year budgets could enhance both effectiveness of public programs and also the overall transparency. And this brings us to the point about how budget transparency and accountability are extremely critical to checking the decline in social sector spending. And again, this point is integrally linked to the increasing concerns that we see around reliability of official data. What we see is that there is very inadequate explanation provided in the budget documents to understand some of the changes that get made. For instance, the decline in the revenue foregone due to methodological changes and then later due to GST has not been explained clearly, as also is the case with the changes made to the GDP figures, etc. And then we come to the point on the issue of accountability. So accountability mechanisms need to be, in some cases, really put in place and in some cases strengthened to ensure that there is adequate oversight. So the fact that the COVID package was not discussed with parliamentarians across party line is a crucial miss. And the role of the parliamentary standing committees is also equally important. So the standing committee meeting of finance that I mentioned earlier, which was held in July, believe it or not, the topic for discussion that was suggested was financing the innovation ecosystem and India's growth companies. Yeah, so additionally, mechanisms such as pre-budget consultations with NGOs, networks must be reinstated to allow for constructive feedback and oversight. And lastly, coming to the point on implementation issues, which are really critical and continue to constrain good quality social sector spending. Let's just take the example of implementation of one program, which is the post-matric scholarship for SCs and STs. This is affected by poor coverage of beneficiaries and abysmally low unit costs. There are other issues as well, but just to flag one issue of this, which is, the PMS provides an annual financial support of 7,000 rupees for admission and tuition fees for classes 11th and 12th, and a monthly maintenance allowance, a princely sum of rupees 230. If we just take the day scholars, the case of day scholars, now you can compare it to the fee structure of some of the schools that, the fee structure in schools these days. So to conclude, as there is a likelihood of resources being constrained, the government must stop all non-priority expenses like, purchase of defense equipment, Central Vista project, establishing religious institutions, and if needed, raise loans to fund social sector spending, social security measures in a substantive manner. And to repeat what Professor Patnaik said earlier, taxing the super rich, taxing income from inheritance and property transactions are other avenues for resource mobilization at this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you for telling us about the wrong and the misplaced budgetary allocations of the government. I now move on to the next speaker, to Thomas Franco. Thomas Franco is the former General Secretary of All India Bank Office Confederation and currently is associated with the People's First. Over to you, sir.
A very
just to also kind of announce that we are expecting Comrade Sitaram Yechuri at any point of time. So he may be joining us soon. Yeah, please go ahead.
A very good evening to all of you. And sitting in the afternoon from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock and listening to very intellectual and emotional lectures is not that easy. So I would like to start with a joke. Few days back, I saw a message in Twitter. The Finance Matters, I had published an article titled Dr. Manmohan Singh was wrong then and he is wrong now also. After he wrote this article in the Hindu. Somebody named Rosamma Thomas, whom I don't know, has posted a comment attaching that article saying that I wish that Sitaram Yechury becomes the Prime Minister of India, Rahul Gandhi becomes the Home Minister of India, and always Frank, which is my Twitter handle name, Thomas Frank was the Finance Minister of India. So that is a good joke. I could laugh that somebody could imagine me as a finance minister. Of course, I think even I can do better than Nirmala Sitharaman ji. Anyway, coming to this Janta Parliament, number one, in 2017, as General Secretary of All India Bank Officers Confederation, I had initiated a program called People's Parliament for Unity and Development under the chairmanship of Mr. Devasahayam IAS, who is retired. And that program was inaugurated at Kanyakumari by Aruna Rai, who is participating in this seminar also today. She inaugurated that program and it went along for quite some time. We created some awareness on the essence of development, alternatives, discussions were taking place. But unfortunately, after I retired in June 2018 from the bank and IBOC, that program did not continue, and now we have initiated this process called the People First. And I'm very happy that this Janta Parliament is taking place. It has taken place earlier also. And looking at the speakers, listening to them last 2 days, some of the speeches late night in the Facebook page or the other pages, I feel that we have very good set of people who should replace the present parliament. And I really wish that people are saying who is there as alternative to Modi ji. Sitaram Yechury is real an alternative, he should be considered. I think some of us should look at the emotional speech which Raghunathan gave. He should be the industry minister. What Usha Ramanathan spoke yesterday, she should be the law minister. And Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar should become the finance minister. And this Niti Ayog, which I call it Aniti Ayog, should be replaced by the Planning Commission once more. And Dr. Prabhat Patnaik should become the Planning Commission Vice Chairman. Things can be changed. There is a host of probability. There are a lot of opportunity. I would restrict myself to banking, financial sector, and little touch on the public sector and public services as a whole. This August body, most of you know why there was a need for nationalization. You know about the recommendations of the R.K. Hasari Committee, All India Rural Credit Survey, P.C. Malonabis Committee report, where he said that 10% of the population is owning 40% of the wealth of the country, which should not be continued. And then nationalization took place on 19 July 1969. And then we had a lot of changes. The IRDP program, which was the biggest poverty alleviation program, Prime Minister's Rojna, self-employment schemes for the unemployed poor. There were a host of activities, and later stage, we have opened 40 crore Jandan accounts. We have disbursed almost 7 crore loans to the Mudra borrowers. But in spite of that, today the top priority of the government is to privatize. It is their goal. It is their vision. It is not that they don't know what is to be done. They know what is to be done. Only thing is that what they want is the wrong path. Privatization of the public sector banks is not going to solve the problem. It is rather going to create a bigger problem, because just one statistics, let me quote 1986. During the time of Mahalanobis, 10% owned 40%. But 1986, after nationalization, when the rural credit, small credits increased drastically, after that, the poverty level had gone down. The lower income group had developed, and the top 10%'s wealth came down to 30%, which started changing once again after 1991, when Mr. Manmohan Singh said that he is going to change the country in the next 5 years and brought in privatization agenda, foreign investment, all that. Now, what is ailing in the public sector banks? Yes, there are a lot of changes required. Number one, the public sector banks are really losing the character of public. They are not really serving the public, because, like Mr. Raghunathan was saying, the programs, the policies are tuned in such a way they do not help the larger majority. Corporates are being favored. 82% of the non-performing assets belong to the corporate. The policies were changed in such a way that the concentration of credit switched over to larger credits instead of the small credit. I have statistics published by Center for Financial Accountability. You can see in their website, which is taken from the RBI website only. So that public sector character, what we need is a filling the gap. The demand-supply gap is huge. So many people want loan, but you have lesser number of branches, lesser number of staff, because of which you are not able to cater to everybody. And the schemes, as Mr. Raghunathan was talking about, the schemes which have been announced as a package, their conditions are so stringent that many people cannot avail those loans. See, that loan for the street vendors, the finance minister announced, just 10,000 rupees. Now, when the circular has come, we find that only the guarantee will be only 15%, not 100%. And the person, if he has to get a loan, he should have a certificate or a license issued by the municipality or the panchayat, which was issued before March. How many of the street vendors would have bothered to take this kind of licenses, you imagine? So there is what they think, what they put it in writing, and what is implemented, totally there is a difference. And the bank charges are affecting the common man. The deposit rate is going down, which is affecting again the small depositors. So there is an overall change needed for the public sector banks as a whole. Number two, the non-performing assets. We are only creating systems which can help to write off the loans. See, the amount of loan written now for the SR Steel, Bhushan Steel, but here a public sector unit called Nilachal Ispat Nigam Limited, which is a public sector unit, which has not defaulted in any loan, which had been doing so well, you are not giving support. The government is not giving support. 6 months, the employees are without salary. So the non-performing asset, there are ways and means to recover that it is very clearly laid out in the report of the Parliament Standing Committee, February 2016. Now they have brought out a more diluted report later. But that report, if it is implemented, the issue of non-performing asset can be very clearly tackled, and banks can. If the NPA crisis is tackled, we don't require fresh capital at all. Number three, the banks today are doing so many things other than banking. That has to be stopped. They should focus on banking in the name of cross-selling, which is really a mis-selling. The district credit committees, block level credit committees have become non-functional. They are not really doing it. If real development has to take place from the grassroots, that has to happen. The development financial institutions have to be brought in. And there should be transparency in lending, transparency in writing out. And there should be also an incentive to the employees and staff. The staff are still crying for a 5-day week. They're still crying for a better salary. Government is showing a step-brotherly treatment. But what it is planning for the small people, ordinary people, non-banking financial companies can be encouraged. They will give credit at 24% interest, whereas the corporates will get interest at a loan at 7% and 8%, and they won't repay. But these poor people will pay 24% interest and also repay the loan. So this is the danger we are getting into. So banking sector has very clear alternative. Dr. C.P. Chandrasekhar and Dr. J.D. Ghosh brought out a book on what is to be done, and it is very relevant today also, and there are alternatives which we can present later. Now coming to the other financial sector, LIC was started with just 5 crore investment of the government. Today each building of LIC is worth more than 5 crores. LIC is supporting the union budget. 1/3 of the budget is supported by the Life Insurance Corporation. LIC is the only company in the whole world which pays 95% of the profit to its customers in the name of bonus in their policy. But that they want to list it and they want to private. Oil sector, they have contributed so much for the development of this country. Today, oil is available in Andamans or Arunachal Pradesh or Jammu and Kashmir in a cheaper rate because of the public sector companies, and they want to privatize BPCL. The railway runs the cheapest trains, but they want to privatize all the railway. 153 railway routes initially on the list. Then they want to privatize the pharmaceutical companies, which created a name for the country as producer of medicine for the world. Like this, there are a number of institutions which they want to sell off. It is like selling the family silver. It is like selling the Mangal Sutra of a lady. This should not be allowed to happen. And yes, there are improvements needed in this system, which we can come out with alternative. There are ways and means. But today, as Dr. Paranjay was saying, this country has become a country by the corporates, for the corporates, of the corporates. There is no rule for Adani, Ambani, and Agarwal, Vedanta Agarwal. The Jio Payment Bank, what he projects is very much right. They are going to sell off the banking system. Some people think that they will be selling the loss-making bank. Who will buy a loss-making bank? They will buy the profit-making bank. So State Bank of India is likely to become Reliance Bank of India because they have joined that Jio Payment Bank with 30% shareholding, and Mrs. Arundhati Bhattacharya is sitting in their board, and Mrs. Manju Agarwal, former Deputy Managing Director, is sitting in the board of Jio Payment Bank. So that danger is there. This public don't know. People have to be made aware of what is happening within this country. Lastly, my friends, this People's Parliament effort, it should start from below. We should take this discussion to the grassroots. The number of webinars which the CFA has organized, there are hundreds of models working in the country. Vikalp Sangam, Dr. Ashish Kothari's group of Kalpa Virish, and so many other organizations have experimented a lot of models. Kerala is a unique model itself within the country in various aspects. The Kudumbashri project, the Panchayat level planning, Kerala Bank of Kerala's own state bank, and the way money is distributed, how they handle the health crisis, how they handle the education crisis. There is a model to be adapted, learned from Kerala itself. And that can be added with the other experiments which is happening across the country with the various civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations. Then I would also suggest that this People's Parliament, the Janta Parliament, we should not stop with discussing at this level. We should come out with a clear alternative agenda for the country. Now people don't know what is going to be the alternative. Somebody else is going to be elected. What I'm going to get? Nothing I'm going to. That kind of frustration is mounting. So, like the UPA wants a common minimum program, now itself we should create a roadmap for the future of this country. We should canvass it among the political parties, among the civil society organizations, among the trade unions, so that we can really bring in a change. Thank you for the great opportunity. Thank you, Ananda.
Thank you very much, Comrade Franco. I mean, thank you for telling us what ails the banking sector now. We welcome Comrade Sitaram Yechuri, who just joined. Before inviting him to speak, I would like to kind of give a brief about what has happened so far. We had Comrade Thomas Isaac talking about federalism and starving of funds to the state, the non-payment of GST compensation. Professor Prabhat Patnaik spoke about the state of economy before the pandemic and the impact of pandemic on the economy. Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar spoke about the fiscal and monetary policy measures, whether they are adequate and what needs to be done. Mr. Paranjoy Guha Thakurta spoke about the financial irregularities and scams. Mr. Raghunandan spoke about the impact on MSMEs and their demands. Pooja Parvati spoke about the budgetary allocations and spendings, and you have heard Comrade Thomas Franco on the banking. Over to you, sir. The floor is yours. You need to unmute, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Am I unmuted? No? You
Yes,
can hear
sir.
me.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this Janta Parliament. And I noticed that you've covered a lot of ground on the economy, and you covered it by very, very competent people. So therefore, there's very little, I'm sure, I'll have to say on it. But the fact remains that I'm sure Professor Prabhat Patnaik would have spoken on this, that even before this COVID arrived, our economy was in a very, very deep crisis. We were actually plunging into a recession. Right at that time, the left parties have been putting forward an economic roadmap, so to speak, even after the COVID came up, where we talked of the immediate measures, the short term and the long term, circulated to everybody. Unfortunately, because of the COVID and the manner in which the lockdown came, that did not really proceed the way we think it should have proceeded. But the fact remains that why was this crisis building up? And the fact of the matter is that through the last few years, few decades of this neoliberal reforms, particularly during the last 6 years, what we have seen really is the development of neoliberalism in a way that it widened the economic inequalities exponentially, which has its own results. I mean, you had the number of billionaires growing up, you had profit rates very high, but the exact opposite is that profit rates increase, wealth accumulates in the hand of the few, precisely because exploitation also intensifies. Now, this has a very clear meaning that exploitation intensifies, the purchasing power in the hands of the people keeps declining. And this decline leads to a fall in overall domestic demand. And that is when the contraction begins. And that's how it began. So the answer is very obvious. The answer is in increasing the people's purchasing capacity. This was all happening before the COVID pandemic struck. And once the COVID pandemic struck and the unplanned manner in which this lockdown came, that completely paralyzed our economy to the extent that between April and June now, it is estimated that the index of industrial production has really fallen by nearly 46%. And the GDP, yesterday the Economic Times headlines it, saying that it is going to be between a fall of 14 to 26%. Inflation is on the rise. Agriculture, you had, I mean, it has been in a distress all along. That has worsened now. Prime Minister sees green shoots in agriculture. That's because there is no other economic activity anywhere else. So you suddenly find, I mean, people going there, acreage is increased. That's increased because there is no other avenue left. So the net result is that how do you increase the purchasing power in the hands of the people? Now, with the lockdown came, the purchasing power has declined very, very steeply. You had the CMI saying about 15 crores of people who were doing their jobs have become unemployed. Now, again, the Prime Minister sees green shoots. He says employment is waning. 86% of this employment, which is reportedly, those who have reported back to work, are your daily wage earners and petty traders whose shops were closed. They have reported to work, but their earnings have not returned. So there's no demand that is there in the economy whatsoever. And the Prime Minister talks of green shoots in terms of the FDI flow. He says 20 billion have flown during the lockdown. And out of this 20 billion, how much is it? 18.6 or something, which is what the sale of Reliance shares abroad, which is not investment. I mean, it's basically sale proceeds that have come up. And Ambani has become the world's fourth or the fifth richest person. I mean, whatever be the rank, that is immaterial. But the point is that how is this government approaching? What I said, the objective must be to increase the domestic demand in our country, which means empowering economically our people. And to empower economically our people, what is required is essentially providing them with jobs. How do jobs get created? It can only happen through a massive public investment. And that massive public investment to build our infrastructure, much needed infrastructure, that will generate and create crores and crores of new jobs. And when they start spending their earnings, demand starts rising and there's purchasing power, and all your closed factories and MSMEs will begin to reopen. There's some chance of a revival. Without that, nothing is going to happen. On the contrary, what is the prescription of this Modi government today? The financial support that they've so-called 20 lakh crores, supposedly 10% of your GDP, then GDP. You see, that out of the 20 lakh crores, everybody has pointed out. I mean, the actual extra expenditure is less than or around or less than 1% of your GDP. That is less than or around 2 lakh crores. The rest is all provision of loans. Now, this is the logic of neoliberalism, that yes, investment is required, but that cannot be state investment. That will have to be private investment. And the state's role must be to facilitate the availability of capital at cheap rates so that loans can be taken and that investment can generate economic growth, activity, etc., etc. Now, this was done even earlier, even before this pandemic struck us. You had these loan packages for the MSMEs. And what happened? Much of that loan from the commercial banks had to go back into the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank had to buy them back at the reverse repo rate because there were no takers. There were no takers for the simple logic that if anybody does any investment, what is produced has to be sold. If it cannot be sold, neither the economy grows nor profits can be made. But there are no buyers in the economy. There are no buyers in this country. And in that situation, remember, even before COVID struck, the 5 rupee biscuit packet of Parle, they were reporting, the drop in sales. That is one of the most staple diets of any Indian, tea and biscuits. If biscuit sales are falling, you can imagine the actual plight of the people. Now, instead of reviving that purchasing capacity, this entire fiscal package was the question of provision of loans. And there are no takers for these loans. Because what will they do with these loans to be taken? And that is how the NPA crisis is going to even build up even much more. But what is the answer to that? The answer to that is not the revival of the economy, but write off your loans, NPAs, to your cronies. So what this is engendering is that you have a fast buck profit generation, crony capitalism of the highest order that finances the ruling party and the BJP today, and that monies are used to destabilize your democratically elected governments, and which we have seen happening in various instances, Goa, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, now Rajasthan they tried, in the Northeast, in various states. Now, this way, what is happening is not merely an economic crisis. What is happening is, along with this economic crisis, is a generally existentialist crisis for the Union of India as declared by the Constitution of India. It's a crisis for the Indian Constitution. All the four fundamental pillars on which it's standing, that is secular democracy, federalism, social justice, and economic sovereignty, strengthening economic self-reliance. Each one of them is being undermined very, 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 very dangerously. So in this context comes the slogan that has been discovered by our Prime Minister Modi, that is the Atmanirbhar Bharat. No, self-reliance or Atmanirbharta has been a single running thread of our entire freedom movement since the days of Dadabhai Naoroji. There's no great, this thing, coinage or something original. But what is this Atmanirbhar Bharat? Atmanirbhar Bharat is essentially the loot of Indian national assets. You've heard large-scale privatization. You heard all the sectors where privatization is happening. But this loot and this large-scale privatization, not only of your productive resources, but also of your services, of your general utilities. If all this loot that is happening, not only is it providing extra profits to private capital, but this is undermining your entire basis of a self-reliant economy. So what is really happening today, it's not Atmanirbhar Bharat. It's an Atma Samarpan Bharat. It is not self-reliance. It is self-subservience. Self-subservience to foreign and domestic capital and the maximization of profits for them. And the net gainer of this through crony capitalism is the ruling party, which is putting all this money at use to actually dismantle the existing structure of laid down by our constitution. Every single constitutional independent authority, from the judiciary downwards, from the parliament downwards, election commission to the CBI to the ED, every one of them is compromised. And we've seen how this loot is now taking place in this so-called PM CARES fund, which has been legitimized yesterday legally by the Supreme Court. And this sort of a loot that is taking place, this is the undermining of Indian constitutional order. And that is required, because what is BJP but the political arm of the RSS, whose entire political vision and project is to convert the secular democratic Republic of India into their version of an extremely intolerant, theocratic, fascistic Hindutva Rashtra. And that is what is unfolding today. So therefore, what is required, that is where all of us will have to come together, is to put that popular pressure on this government to undertake massive public investment projects, massive public investments to build our much needed infrastructure, economic and social infrastructure, and generate jobs, and thereby boost domestic demand. And on that basis, move for an economic revival. That must be the single focus point of our alternate agenda. And that is where I'll appeal to all of you to come and together, let us try and put this pressure on this government to ensure that this happens. So thank you. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to be with you and share some of my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Comrade. I mean, you spoke about how the neoliberal economic model has kind of put wealth into a few hands and then widened the inequality which is on the ground. You argued for larger public investment for job creation, and also you spoke about the undermining and compromising of constitutional institutions. It was really, really a great intervention that you made. Thank you for that. I move on to the next speaker, Mr. Lakshmi Narayan. Lakshmi Narayan is with the Azim Premji Foundation, and he will talk about the perspective of corporates in the present state of economy. Over to you, Mr. Lakshmi Narayan.
Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. Clearly, I'll make my comments brief, and like I said, it's pretty much from the perspective of operating companies on the ground. Just as a perspective, we have a role both on the philanthropy side as well as the investment side. Our investment arm looks at and tracks a lot of companies, both large size and mid size in India, and we have regular conversations with them. So what I'm going to talk about is in some way a summation of what we hear from them and what they see as their state of affairs as of today. First of all, and in the process, I may touch on a few macro themes, but that's also what we sort of hear from them as well. I'm no economist, so I'm only so I'm just that's why I'm making that preemptive disclosure. First, I think there's no question in anybody's mind that we are looking at a shrinkage of growth. From where we started in March, where different people had different estimates of growth, today we are looking at a scenario where most people have estimates of decline. The measure to be through the GDP growth or earnings, and I'll come to earnings in a moment. We are talking of declines which range from about 6% to about 10%. And while within that, what when you break that down, you realize that there's actually a growth estimated in agriculture. So really the decline for industry or services is significantly more. And that is what is really the tone that we hear from companies. What are they sort of worried about? There are issues at three different levels. The first level is the issue of demand destruction. There was a lot of debate, perhaps around April mostly, and maybe even May, as to what we are seeing now is whether it is demand postponement or demand destruction. Yes, there are certain industries where things have to be consumed immediately, airline seats, hotels, hotel rooms, industries of that sort where time consumes it. If nobody consumes it, there is a complete destruction. But many other places, people said that, oh, it's only a postponement. When things come back, it will, when things normalize, things will come back to kind of old levels of growth. We are clearly not seeing that. In fact, it's almost ironic that today people are celebrating, saying that, oh, we are at 80% or 90% of June last year or July last year. Which actually means we are at a shrinkage of 10 to 20%. In an economy where we, in a country where we thought we were going to see growth for an extremely long periods of time, we are happy that it's 80% level, but actually we should be worried that there's a shrinkage. So clearly there is a people are now tending to think about demand destruction, which has very different implications from a demand postponement. So let me again break that down into two or three things. One, what it means is that people who had were willing to put up with certain expenses in the hope that these expenses will pay off over a period of time are not spending those expenses anymore. So a lot of anecdotal cases of people who paid salaries for their employees for the 10 days in March, and many people even right through April, are now beginning to say that let's really find ways to rationalize costs. So there is job losses. There are people who are being sort of moved out of roles, both on direct basis and contract basis. And there's enough talked about migration and reverse migration, so I shall not go into that. But that's one clear indication of the fact that companies are laying off people. Second, people are looking at tightening a lot of costs, which also means that there are surround employment. Every company, for every employee a company has, there are at least anywhere between 2 and 8 jobs that are created in surround industries: logistics, transport, catering. There are various nature of jobs that people provide. There's clearly shrinkage of that. People are rationalizing that. We're hearing anecdotes of how people can reduce security guards in factories because there's really no activity inside factory. If there was going to be a beat every hour, now should there be a beat every three hours? And therefore, can we reduce the number of people we need on the security guard, security duty, and so on and so on. People are really getting granular on that part. So there is direct job loss and there is indirect job loss. Second part of the whole thing is about capacity. All people who had plans of putting capacity expansion have all put it on hold. Third, obviously, is that I think there is selective hiring happening, but that's the word, it is selective. At aggregate level, absolutely there is no hiring happening. So again, that's kind of a thing. So clearly the demand destruction has played out a lot on the input side. There is a thing, and that's a direct result of the fact that there are no customers, there are no revenues. It also means that when companies, especially the organized sector, reduces employment, it also has an implication for consumption in certain other sectors. We are seeing that in things like housing, housing loan, retail loan. I think we will see numbers of companies with retail lending over a period of time deteriorate, because they will find that people are going to start defaulting. There was a huge expansion of the retail borrowing in the last 2 to 3 years, and they had companies, and especially a lot of new age companies, lending to people with very who are not normally lendable kind of a stuff. So all those defaults will come in, and they're going to add, and these are not counted in the NPA pile. So there's clearly the demand destruction is going to have ripples which are multiple, and they're going to go beyond one industry. The second challenge that we kind of have out here is to do with the fact that company in their cost structures, especially, and people talked of the package and the borrowing cost. There are two elements to any borrowing. There is a tenor and there is the cost. There's been some concession on the tenor, but obviously there's cost. The cost clock is still ticking for them. So actually, one of the things we hear from companies is that after they took the first round of moratorium, second time around, people are not taking the benefit of moratorium because they're not finding it useful, because it's not really alleviating their pain. So they think they have to go for something which is far more structural. The third is on the operations front, because of the nature of the way the lockdowns have become localized and hyper localized, there are significant disruptions in supply chain and logistics. So if a company's warehouse is in a particular place and there's a lockdown in that place, that completely affects their distribution and sales in that area. This is especially in FMCG and kind of areas we're hearing that. Or if they have to get their supplies and there's some blockage in between, so their ability to predict and stuff is gone down. Another implication of that is obviously the transport thing is not fully back. There's a big amount of distress at a transporter's level, which itself is, I think, an interesting story by itself. Most operators in India are what they call SRTOs, small road transport operators. Many of them have challenges because their fleet is grounded. Many drivers don't want to go on long distance. Again, there are challenges across states. Even though there's supposed to be a lot of easing, there is some amount of harassment on the ground. So drivers are not as willing, both because of fear and because fear of the disease itself, as also the challenges of sort of having to move around. So logistics for companies is also getting affected. And like I said, that has one of the implications is the whole SRTO and they're part of the SME sector. They have that have an implication for them, but it's also having implications for the thing. So there is demand destruction. There is a whole thing about operating efficiency. There is this thing about finance and finance, especially the cost kind of a stuff. Are there green shoots? Well, there is the view across most industries is that this entire pain is extremely severe in the urban and metropolis areas. It is less severe in rural and small towns. Having said that, no one is telling us that there is anywhere it's business as usual in any part of the country. So there is impact everywhere. It's not now. It's all relative kind of a stuff. What are people now kind of looking for in some sense? Um, uh, People are now looking at a very large. There's clearly a requirement for a demand stimulus. All the actions that have been taken so far have not really led in a stimulus, and that's where I talked of a little bit of economics. The view is, the common view in the industry is that they don't expect anything to come out because the fiscal space expected, fiscal space available both for state and center put together is perceived to be very little. Of course, there are questions from economists as to, is there a sanctity to a number in terms of fiscal deficit, especially in an environment like this. But like I said, I'm not an economist, I'm not expert, but there is some merit in the argument that perhaps we should go way beyond what is a quote unquote acceptable limit as per economics, and do that stimulus, and that's what in some sense is what we are hearing the government to think. We expect industry to expect from the government. Uh, in spite of all, there's also expectations on what can they do in terms of release of payments. Again, there's a lot of money stuck with the government for many enterprises. Again, it's a bit of a vicious loop because many state governments don't have money to pay, and therefore, again, including in some of these COVID-related reliefs where people have spent money and they're having receivables from the governments, they have not been getting paid. So their working capital is also got very badly stretched, and that's one more thing that the people are very they're hoping that even that clearings of that itself can make a thing. So one clear takeaway that we hear from the ground is that there is huge amount of caution bordering on actually a shrinkage, as in people don't want to do any large scale experiments, people do not want to have any large scale thing. And I think this is going to be one of those rare situations, one of those situations where you will not see an initiative from the private sector. They need to be prime pumped. They will want the demand to come back. Um, and one other observation I had is, again, from an investment point of view, look at, while, like I said, while people are celebrating that this is not as good as bad as we thought, the reality is that the earnings estimates from the beginning of the year to now have dropped dramatically. And this is not new. One of the things that we must remember is that even before the pandemic struck, we were not in a great space from an economy point of view. We were wobbling. So for the last 6 to 7 years, every year, companies have started the year with an estimate of growth and profit and of around between, depending on the industry, between 15 and 20%, and ended the year with low single digit. So there have been disappointments for a while. So we have come off from we are coming in from a situation where they were already not in the best of shapes, and this has worsened. That's the reason why I sort of submit that I don't think that this is going to be a private sector investment-led, consumption-led kind of a recovery, but it's going to be more from expecting a stimulus to come from somewhere from the government. That's the expectation. And what will come out of that, we don't know, or it will be one extended long thing. I want to end with two particular areas that I hear a little bit of, one positive and one sort of a negative, or one concern. The positive, obviously, is that India has benefited immensely from the low crude prices. So most recently we've seen balance of payment surplus. Of course, that's also because imports have shrunk faster than the exports have shrunk. But we are sitting for a reasonable time on a benign oil price, and oil is a big import of India. Therefore, the expectation is that this will remain benign, which means that the pressure on the external front for us is going to be something manageable, and that's a huge opportunity. I think even versus the estimate at the budget time to what it is right now, there is going to be headspace of extra money available to the government on the foreign thing, and that is something that we have to see how that's a positive that one can use, and how well that is used is something that people are looking carefully at. On the flip side, of course, there is this should I say, and concern on the edge on inflation. we have seen inflation gently go up. Uh, the current estimate continues to be that maybe inflation will moderate, because right now there's been a spike in food inflation, and as and the agricultural output post the rains come out, and the vegetables and the thing sort of the supply comes back into the market, there will be some amount of cooling off and the inflation will be under control. But clearly it's on as a trajectory, it's been up, and if that sort of continues, we're going to have a much bigger difficulty, because then again we're going to have cost pressures additionally coming onto the companies, and already under a lot of pressure, they won't know how to sort of react to that. So bottom line, I think I would like to say that what we hear as people working with companies on the ground, there is huge demand contraction, and right now the expected solution has been externalized. That is, very few companies are thinking that they will do something. Well, everyone would like to sort of make all the statements in forums saying that they will go and conquer the world and they'll invest when the things are down, etc. We don't see that happening to a large extent. So this is not going to be an easy way out. And if there's any expectation that with whatever has been done so far, industry will be up and running, I think that's going to be a very, very unlikely scenario.
So thank you, Mr. Lakshmi Narayan. I mean, thank you for telling us that how the formal sector is kind of affected with this. I mean, you were saying that even before the pandemic set in, the economy was down, and whatever steps taken so far is not good enough for the revival. You also said about the key challenges about it. So thank you very much. It was very useful. We move on to the next speaker now, Professor Ritu Diwan. Professor Diwan is the Vice President of the Indian Society for Labor Economics and former Director of Department of Economics, University of Mumbai. Over to you, ma'am.
One second, my computer's, the internet is a bit unstable. I don't know how children are managing their lives on this. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and to be part of a panel who I think one has been working with and along and reading and also I think the many issues which have been raised. I'm not going to raise them again, but I will be talking basically on the issue of labor and labor rights. And the background of it, of course, we know there was already a collapse of the economy. I'm not getting into all that. But keeping that in mind, keeping that location in mind, for for us, I think what we really have to think that, of course, we know that the contradiction between labor and capital, the share of wages, the share of profits, and there's an eternal contradiction between them. And this has always been there, and it was already, the share of wages was already declining for quite some period of time, particularly since neoliberalism. But the extent to which it has gone today is I think something very new, particularly in the last 4 years, and very much so under the cover of COVID, which is what I really call what has been going on. And this has been done in relative terms, and it has also been done in absolute terms, which is something which is quite unforgivable in terms of the time of work, the hours of work, etc. I also think that the nature of the state has never been as naked and as blatant as it is today. And the devastation of the working class has never been as much as it is today. Started with demonetization already at a very poor level, went from, I think, desperation to destitution, really, during the period of demonetization. Then comes your GST. And then it's, of course, the pandemic. But I think what was much more harmful to labor rights and to the people of our country, to the citizens of our country, was the policy response to the pandemic, more, in fact, than the pandemic itself. So you have 4 days to light your lamps and clang your thalis, but you have 4 hours to close down an entire nation where 1/3 are migrants, and where 75% or 90%, in fact, are below the what should be a decent standard of living. So this, in a way, has led, and I think it has not only led, it has reinforced all forms of inequalities, whether it's caste or community. Of course, there's a political agenda which goes along the economic agenda. So your divisions which have already existed, your structures which are already dividing you, whether it's class or gender or community, all these have been reinforced and all these have been strengthened. So, when terms like social distancing are used, it's something which I find very objectionable because we already distance socially. So that's one aspect I think which we need to keep in mind, the issue of the divisions which already exist and which are getting strengthened by the day, by the policy more than anything else. There are, I think, two. I'd like to just divide what I'm saying into two components. One, what has already been happening and what is going on in the last 2 years where labor rights are concerned. That is in the context of the labor codes which have been introduced. And secondly, under the cover of COVID, the kind of changes which have come. And so, therefore, I think one needs to see the two slightly separate. We are familiar with the four codes, the code on wages, which has already been introduced. And in fact, day after is the last day for putting any kinds of suggestions and objections. So I just hope that people are also, some of us, of course, have taken it up, many organizations too, but this is something which really needs to be focused on. Now, what the code on wages does, it takes four laws into it. It replaces all of these codes, replace a certain number of laws. So your the labor code, your wage code replaces your payment of bonus, it replaces your minimum wages, it replaces payment of wages, and it replaces also several other aspects of definitions which I will be getting into. Now, I won't go into detail. There's a huge long analysis which is there, but just to point out some fundamental aspects of it, that what the code on wages does is when it defines worker, work, and workplace, it leaves out a huge number of workers, and it leaves out about 60 to 70% of the women workers, because what it defines as an employee or as a worker is in relation only to an establishment or to an industry, not to a private household. So, by definition, what this means is that there is no worker status now given to domestic workers, nor to BD workers, nor to any kind of home based workers, and nor to apprentices. So, BD workers who have fought for years, as we know, and got their bonus and minimum wages and housing and whatever other benefits which they have, are not going to be covered under whatever benefits in quotes are supposed to come from this particular law. And as an illustration, where apprentices are concerned, you have the Sumangali workers who are there, and those are very adolescent young girls, 14, 15 young girls, interstate and intrastate migrant workers, girls who are there, are not going to be covered under the Code on Wages Act. Now, even within this act, till now, when the payment of bonus has been incorporated and replaced, if it is when it is replaced in the code of wages, what it has done, that earlier the computation of bonus was written by law under the act. By combining and merging with the code on wages, the bonus or the principle of the share of wages which go as bonus is going to be defined and decided only by the executive. So workers have no right, there's no legal component, it's just an executive decision which is going to decide what exactly the bonus is going to be. The code on occupational safety, health, and working conditions, and all this is going on without any kind of democratic discussion. It's just something which is imposed. So there's no parliament, there's no debate, and there is just an imposition and a larger and larger centralization which is taking place, and a concentration of power even over labor. So under the Code on Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions, there are 13 acts which are going to be replaced. I'm not listing them all out. It's going to take too long. And within this, there is no safe transport to be provided. The creches which were there earlier, they are not going to be provided. And many differentiations and many changes which have come. And where women are concerned in particular, the entire aspect of sexual harassment at the workplace has been totally separated from the Code on Occupational Safety. So as a worker, if you are sexually harassed at work, it is now you do not have the right. You have to go beyond the act and you have to go as a woman, but you cannot go as a worker. So I think this separation and this very heavily and terribly patriarchal definition and separation which has taken place is something to be noted on. The Code on Social Securities, which is something so important, it replaces 15 laws. No scheme is mentioned. All it says is that welfare schemes as may be framed. So there is no guarantee of any kind of a protection or universalization. And if this was not enough, over a period of time, over the last year, and the last, I think, was on Gandhi Jayanti last year, on October 2nd last year, is that all the cess and welfare funds of workers, which is where the employers were also contributing something, that all those have been stopped and all those have been totally banned from any kind of functioning. So there is no contribution which the employer is going to make to any of these funds. Where the money is going to go, we know under the BAKWA, that is under the Construction and Building Workers Act, there is 65,000 crores just lying. The case is on in the Supreme Court, but there's no time to hear. Now, what's happening to this money? Where is it going is a totally different issue. The fourth code, which is on industrial relations, replaces any right of dissent. I think this is something which has been there at many different levels, whether it's a political, cultural, social level. But now, even where labor is concerned, 3 laws are replaced under this. And now, earlier, a 60 days notice had to be given by the essential services providers. So that's your transport and your trains, etc., electricity. But now a 60 days notice has to be given by all sectors, even by ASHA workers, even by teachers, even by academicians, by any and every category. 60 days notice for strike and even for a casual leave. I think this denial of any kind of an opposition is something which is not acceptable, and I think it goes against the very definition of a democracy and a republic. I'm not going to in other details about how there's now no labor inspectors, there's inspector come facilitator, because it's very clear, the code starts very clearly by saying this is for the ease of doing business, and this is what the ministers and all of them have also been saying. So that is one ongoing attack on workers' rights and whatever they had attained over a very long period of time. The second is what is being done under the pandemic. It started by Bihar, followed by Gujarat, it started by UP, followed by Gujarat, Bihar, MP, UK, that is Uttarakhand, Rajasthan, with partially withdrew it, Madhya Pradesh, and several other states, total of states. And then again, you can see your different political alignments of who passes and who does not pass this. Now, again, not going to the details because it is just so long. Your 8 hours are not sacrosanct anymore. It is 12 hours. And in Gujarat, they had said if there is an emergency, the employer can exist on up to 16 hours workday. I mean, it's unbelievable how any human can think of any human doing this kind of work. There are also withdrawal of every single benefit under every single act which exists. No toilets are to be provided. No creches will be provided. No water will be provided. I think I cannot even visualize the kind of situation a worker would be forced to do this in. Wages, UP has done this already, that the wages for the next 3 years must be paid not in cash but into accounts. All right, now that itself, when you're living on a daily basis and on sometimes even on an hourly basis, when it is piece rated, it's going to really finish off whatever kind of survival strategies these workers had. And in the relief package, of course, there's a lot one can talk about it, but that it's a slate of hand and it's not really distributed anything at all. It's just reallocation of the budget here and there. There's no relief in any kind of a way. But one statement which really, I think, made me more furious than anything else was the fact that the government, in its plat, it it says, it says a lot, and it says that employers should pay on humanitarian grounds their workers their wages. Now, whether the smaller employers, we have seen the presentation of Raghu, and it was one of the most painful, what they are going through, small MSMEs in particular, but also to make this kind of a statement and then not pay your nurses for 3 months, not pay your doctors for 2 months, and not pay your ASHA workers for 4 months. This is it's just is something which is just not. I really don't know what words to use. Of course, there are other kinds of statements which are made and which are happening, that whatever future employment comes will be given to the sons of the soil. So you have your regionalism component, which is coming up very strongly. What is going to do the migrants is another issue. The issues of privatization, which are going to reduce whatever few jobs are there. And this Atmanirbharta, which I've never heard a greater contradiction. You talk about self-reliance, and at the same time, you're begging for foreign investment. So I think seeing it in this broader kind of a context, which is there, in fact, this period of what is, it's actually a lockup. It's not a lockdown. All right, it's what Kashmir has been functioning and experiencing for more than 1 year. And in this entire period, this time should have been taken to improve the situation, whether it's health, infrastructure, etc., etc., setting up community kitchens for eternity for all migrants. So it provides them basic nutrition, it provides employment to a large number of people. This one ration, one nation, one ration card, one nation, again is a centralization of power and of distribution of whatever resources that they are. And there are, I think, many suggestions maybe which one can make. But I just would like to end on, I've been working with the migrant workers, setting up camps, providing foods, etc., etc. And I just want to, these 2 or 3 experiences. One is, we have never, and this happened during demonetization, and it has happened now again in a worse manner, and that is skilled workers, whether you're construction workers or carpenter or whatever you are, actually being forced to do manual scavenging. And for the first time in Bombay, we had a woman who did manual scavenging. She actually went down into the sewers. The situation was so desperate. Reports have also come from, whether it's Bihar or UP or several other areas, that women are now working 8 hours a day at the wage rate of 15 rupees. 15, not even 20, 15 rupees. And sex workers who are charging 10 rupees. That is the level of desperation. And I think it's not just a government that doesn't care, or it's I think very deliberate. It's deliberate because the nature of the state doesn't lie where workers are concerned. It lies very clearly, as several others have said, where the opposite, those who employ labor at a much higher level, concentration of capital, of power, of justice, of every single component. And just the last, I will end with the words of this one worker uh, who, we were talking and there was a plane flying overhead, and he said, "Dekho, NRI वापस आ रहे हैं." And NRI meaning non-resident Indians. And another worker says that, no, we are also NRIs, And I was like, I couldn't understand. And he said, we are non-required Indians. And for me, that really defines, I think, the exactly what is happening today, and something which we need to, I think, all get together very, very urgently, very desperately, in whatever way we can. And this Janta Parliament, I think, is a wonderful forum for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rituji. I mean, it was really sad, shocking, and devastating to kind of know how the state of affairs are. And it looks like the government wanted the excuse of economic revival to kind of take off all labor rights. I mean, it's shocking to kind of know even not providing water to them despite kind of employing them for 16 hours. Thank you very much for making that very forceful intervention. With that, the present agenda item stands concluded. Voting on the resolutions to be taken up now. Can I request Nachiket to put up the resolutions?
You can vote now.
Okay. I'll read out the resolutions. Given that banks are being run with money deposited by people, no bank should charge the depositors for doing basic banking transactions. Implement recommendations of Standing Committee on Finance on non-performing assets. To ease the suffering of people and MSMEs, RBI should waive the interest on loans during the pandemic period. Development banks should be brought back for large-scale lending purpose. Scheduled commercial banks should only be allowed to serve the people by focusing on retail lending. And the fifth one, micro, small, and medium businesses should be assisted with direct monetary relief instead of credits. You can cast your votes now.
Just to give an instruction for voting, if you're logged in from your desktop, you have to scroll down to vote for all questions. But if you're logged in from your phone, you will see after you answer one question, please click the next button till you're finished.
You have 30 more seconds to vote. आपके पास 30 सेकंड है मतदान के लिए.
Who's not muted?
The poll results have come. The first resolution of bank charges, 97, I mean, it stands passed with 97% votes in favor and 3% against. On the implementation of Standing Committee on Finance, I mean, recommendations on NPAs, it's an overwhelming 100% in favor. Ease of suffering of people and MSMEs to waive off the interest on loans, that's 95% in favor and 5 against. Bringing back the development banks back for large-scale lending, 97% is in favor and 3 against. And micro, small, and medium business should be assisted with direct monetary relief. It stands passed with 95% in favor and 5 against. The next resolution, number 1, stringent laws should be made to recover the bad loans. Writing off large credits should be supervised by the Parliament. The second, insolvency and bankruptcy court should be reviewed immediately. Corporations should not get benefit from IBC process by buying companies at throwaway prices, leaving behind banks with huge losses. The third, to bring transparency in public finance institutions, details of their investments, details of willful defaulters, accounts of written off NPAs should be made public. Fourth one, release of all information on money collected under PM cares and distribute to state governments for relief purposes. And the fifth one, take back and stop the tax concession given to corporates in September 2019.
You have 30 more seconds to vote. आपके पास 30 सेकेंड है वोट करने के लिए और
So the results have come. The first one, stringent laws should be made to recover the bad loans, stands passed with 98% in favor and 2 against. Insolvency and bankruptcy code should be immediately reviewed. That stands passed with 98% in favor and 2 against. The details of willful defaulters, written off NPAs should be made public. That stands passed with an overwhelming 100% in favor. Fourth, the release of all information on PM cares and distribute that money to state governments for relief purpose stands passed with 100% in favor. Take back and stop the tax concession given to the corporates stands passed with 95% in favor and 5 against. The third one, the states should be allowed to borrow from RBI at repo rate. Second, expand MNREGA to 200 days per household and provide initial assistance to states willing to set up urban employment guarantee schemes. Third, ensure that farmers are able to sell their crops at procurement prices or higher. Fourth, double public spending on health and transfer to state governments on the basis of the Finance Commission formula. Fifth, 2% wealth tax along with inheritance tax on the top 1% rich. This alone can help in securing better food security, health system, and education for all. And the sixth one, government should contain fiscal deficit through borrowing from RBI.
आपके पास 30 सेकेंड और हैं वोट करने के लिए. You have 30 more seconds to vote.
The results are out now. States should be allowed to borrow from RBI at repo rate. Stands passed with 97% in favor and 3 against. Expanding MNREGA to 200 days per household. Stands passed with 95% in favor and 5 against. Ensure that farmers are able to sell their crops at procurement prices or higher. Stands with 100% in favor. Stands passed with 100% in favor. Double the public spending on health and transfer to state governments on the basis of Finance Commission. Formula stands passed at with 97 in favor and 3 against. 2% wealth tax on the 1% rich stands with an overwhelming 100% in favor. Stands passed with an overwhelming 100% in favor. Government should contain fiscal deficit through borrowing from RBI. Stands passed with 90% in favor and 10 against.
We are done with the polling.
Thank you. With this, the present agenda item stands concluded. It's my privilege to give vote of thanks to members to this August House, to speakers and experts and the conveners of this session. The House stands adjourned to reconvene tomorrow, August 20th at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Tomorrow, the Janta Parliament session will start at 10 a.m. The first session will be on Vulnerable Communities Part 1, where we will cover issues related to women, LGBTQI, sex workers, and religious minorities, followed by a session on labor and employment at 3 p.m. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.